Hey folks, tonight we're diving into the extraordinary lives and remarkable endurance of medieval peasants, the unsung champions who, against all probability, managed to endure some of the harshest and most unforgiving nights in recorded history. From creative insulation methods to shared warmth tactics, their narrative is one of determination, cleverness, and sheer willpower. So, before you settle in, consider hitting that like button and subscribing, but only if you truly appreciate what we create here, and drop a comment telling us your location and what hour it is where you are. It's always intriguing to discover who's listening from across the planet. Now, lower those lights, perhaps activate a fan for that gentle ambient sound, and let's drift into tonight's exploration together. Medieval winter was a death sentence. When you imagine medieval existence, your mind might conjure images of tournament nights, elaborate banquets, and festive gatherings. But for the typical peasant, winter was less about celebration and more about a simple question: how do we avoid perishing tonight? It wasn't merely a season, it was an ordeal of stamina that arrived annually, like a particularly merciless instructor who offered no second opportunities. Winter announced itself not with gentle snowflakes and cozy evenings, but with brutal, bone-chilling winds that tore through the countryside like invisible predators. Temperatures plummeted without warning. The sun, already weak and distant during the short days, offered little comfort. By mid-afternoon, darkness was already creeping across the land, swallowing everything in its path. For medieval peasants, winter's arrival meant more than discomfort. It meant a genuine fight for survival that would last months. Every year, entire families faced the same grim calculation: will we make it to spring? The statistics were sobering. Historical records suggest that winter mortality rates spiked dramatically, particularly among the very young and the elderly. Hypothermia, malnutrition, and winter diseases claimed countless lives. Villages that entered winter with 50 families might emerge in spring with only 45. Preparation began in autumn, but no amount of planning could fully prepare you for what was coming. You could gather firewood, stockpile food, and repair your dwelling as best you could. But when the first true freeze arrived, when the ground hardened like iron and the air became sharp enough to slice your lungs with each breath, you realized that survival would require more than preparation. It would require innovation, cooperation, and an almost superhuman ability to endure suffering that modern humans can barely comprehend. Mud huts against freezing winds. Envision this. You're residing in a minuscule mud and timber shelter, with walls so flimsy you could likely detect a bird's sneeze from outside. No insulation, no windows unless you consider a small opening plugged with animal hide, and certainly no temperature-control disputes with your siblings. The interior temperature of your dwelling was typically just a courteous few degrees above whatever the climate was producing outside. If it was freezing outdoors, it was politely marginally less freezing inside. Congratulations on your medieval climate control system. These structures, which historians generously call homes, were constructed using a technique known as wattle and daub. Picture a giant basket of woven sticks and branches. Then imagine smearing that basket with a delightful mixture of mud, straw, and yes, animal dung. The dung wasn't added for shock value. It was actually a practical binding agent that helped hold the mud together and provided a small amount of insulation. But here's the problem. This construction method, while ingenious given the limited resources available, was absolutely terrible at keeping out the cold. The walls were perhaps 6 to 8 inches thick at best. Modern insulation standards would require walls many times thicker to achieve even basic thermal protection. The structure itself was simple. 4 walls, usually no more than 10 to 12 feet on each side, creating a single room where an entire family would live, work, eat and sleep. The ceiling was low, often barely 6 feet high, which actually helped a bit with heat retention. Less space to warm meant the meager heat from the fire didn't have as far to travel, but the walls themselves were the real problem. As the mud dried and aged, it cracked. The wattle framework beneath would shift and settle. Gaps would appear between the daub and the wooden supports. Each of these cracks became a highway for cold air to rush inside. Imagine trying to stay warm in a structure that's essentially a very enthusiastic wind tunnel with a roof, because that's precisely what medieval peasants were dealing with. When darkness swallowed everything, nights were absolutely the worst. Darkness consumed everything. The wind wailed like an enraged spirit, and the fire in the hearth flickered weakly, attempting its best, but primarily just warming the feet of whoever was positioned closest. If you were on the opposite side of the chamber, apologies, you might as well have been camping outside with worse provisions. Medieval nights arrived early and stayed late. During the winter months, darkness could descend as early as 4 o'clock in the afternoon. That meant up to 16 hours of cold, pitch-black night. No streetlights, no electric lamps, no comforting glow from neighboring houses. Just darkness so complete it felt like a physical presence pressing in on you. The psychological toll was in modern humans, accustomed to artificial lighting and climate-controlled environments, can barely comprehend what it meant to spend more than half of each day in near total darkness, shivering, with only a flickering fire for light and warmth. The fire provided the only illumination, casting dancing shadows that made the walls seem to move and breathe. Every creak of the wooden frame, every gust of wind rattling the roof, every unexplained sound became magnified in the darkness. Children huddled close to their parents not just for warmth but for comfort against the dark. Stories were told, prayers were whispered, and families drew together in a tight circle of shared body heat and shared fear. Sleep, when it came, was fitful at best. You didn't sleep through the night as we do now. Instead, you drifted in and out of consciousness, waking frequently to tend the fire, adjust your position to find a warmer spot, or simply because the cold had penetrated so deeply that your body refused to stay asleep. The darkness brought with it a kind of timelessness. Without clocks, without any way to measure the hours, night seemed to stretch on forever. You couldn't know if dawn was an hour away or 6 hours away. You could only wait, shiver and pray that you'd see the morning sun. And when dawn finally arrived, often you'd wake to find frost inside the house, on the walls, on your blankets, even on your hair if you'd been sleeping near a draft. Every morning that you opened your eyes and still had feeling in your extremities was considered a minor miracle. This was the reality of medieval winter nights. Not romantic, not cozy, not anything like the sanitized versions we see in movies and paintings. It was brutal, exhausting and utterly relentless. Wattle and daub construction. If you believe your apartment is drafty because the window doesn't seal correctly, medieval peasants would desire a conversation. Their dwellings weren't just drafty, they were fundamentally very enthusiastic wind passages with a covering. Most peasant houses utilized what historians politely term wattle and daub construction. Translation: sticks crisscrossed like an oversized basket coated with a charming blend of mud, straw, and animal manure. Yes, manure. They weren't attempting to be disgusting. Dung was an inexpensive, adhesive insulator. Plus, it was perpetually readily accessible, shall we say. The construction process was actually quite clever, given the limitations. First, vertical wooden posts were driven into the ground or set into a shallow foundation. These formed the main structural supports. Then, thin, flexible branches, usually hazel or willow, were woven horizontally between the posts, creating a lattice framework. This was the what. Next came the daub, a mixture that varied by region, but typically consisted of clay soil, sand, straw, and yes, animal dung. The dung, usually from cattle or horses, contained fibers that helped bind the mixture and prevented excessive cracking as it dried. Some builders also added lime or chalk, if available, which increased durability. This mixture was then pressed and smoothed onto both sides of the wattle framework, creating walls typically 6 to 8 inches thick. When fresh, the daub was easy to work with, almost like thick plaster, but as it dried, problems emerged. The drying process was uneven. The outer surface dried first, while the interior remained moist. This caused tension and cracking. The straw and dung fibers helped minimize this, but they couldn't eliminate it entirely. Within months of construction, small cracks would appear. Within years, those cracks would widen. Temperature fluctuations made it worse. When winter arrived and the walls froze, the moisture trapped inside would expand, creating more cracks. When spring came and the walls thawed, they'd settle and shift, creating new gaps. These walls, no matter how carefully constructed, didn't stand much probability against a proper winter storm. The freezing wind located every fissure, every opening, and cheerfully waltzed its way into the one-room dwellings, swirling around and ensuring you never became too comfortable. Privacy? Absolutely not. Warmth? Not really. Character building? Definite. Roofs that leaked everything, and then there were the roofs. Thatched roofs appeared picturesque, certainly, but after a few months of rain and snow, they drooped, leaked, and occasionally permitted in the local wildlife. Nothing declares pleasant evening like a squirrel dropping onto your dinner. Thatching was an art form, and a good thatcher was valued in the community. The process involved laying bundles of dried grass, straw, reeds, or heather in overlapping layers on a wooden frame. When done properly and maintained regularly, a thatched roof could actually provide decent protection. But here's the catch: done properly and maintained regularly were luxuries most peasants couldn't afford. A professional thatching job required skill, time, and material. Peasants, already working from dawn to dusk just to survive, often had to thatch their own roofs with whatever materials they could gather. The result was frequently less than ideal. Thatch degrades over time. Each season of rain compressed it. Birds pulled out strands for their net. Roots set in from moisture. Wind tore away sections. A properly maintained thatched roof needed repairs or replacement every few years. Many peasant roofs went much longer between repairs. As the thatch deteriorated, problems multiplied. Water penetration was the first issue. When it rained or snowed, moisture would seep through the damaged sections, dripping onto the inhabitants below. In summer, this was merely annoying. In winter it was catastrophic. Imagine lying under your thin blanket on a freezing night, and suddenly feeling cold water dripping onto your face. That water would quickly freeze, creating ice patches on the floor and even on your bedding. The moisture also encouraged mold growth, making the air inside the house damp and unhealthy. But water wasn't the only thing that came through the roof. Gaps in the thatch created openings for wind, dramatically increasing heat loss. They also provided entry points for animals, mice, rats, birds, insects, and yes, occasionally squirrels or other small creatures seeking shelter from the cold. Some peasants tried to address these issues by adding additional layers of thatch over problem areas, creating a patchwork roof that grew thicker and heavier over time. Others spread clay or mud over sections of thatch to seal leaks, though this added weight and could cause structural problems. The weight of snow was another serious concern. A heavy snowfall could cause a poorly maintained roof to sag or even collapse, potentially killing those sleeping below. Every winter brought stories of families crushed when their roof gave way under the weight of accumulated snow and ice. Dirt floors and rising cold windows, if they existed at all, were laughably tiny and usually covered with thin animal hides or wooden shutters. Glass was so expensive that even the lord of the manor probably couldn't afford more than a single tiny pane. And they were just happy if the wind didn't rip the cowhide right off the wall mid-blizzard. To make matters worse, floors were often just compacted dirt. When it rained or snowed heavily, mud seeped up through the ground, so technically you could say they had indoor water feature. Not that they appreciated it. Let's talk about these floors because they were a special kind of medieval misery. The floor of a peasant home wasn't really a floor at all, not in any sense we'd recognize today. It was simply the ground, perhaps slightly leveled and compacted from years of foot traffic, but still fundamentally just dirt. In summer this created dust. Every step kicked up fine particles that hung in the air, coating everything and irritating lungs already compromised by smoke from the hearth. But summer was paradise compared to winter. When winter arrived, the ground froze solid. The top layer of soil became as hard as concrete, rough and uneven, painful to walk on with bare feet or thin cloth wrappings. But worse than the hardness was the cold. The earth is an enormous heat sink. During winter the ground acts like a massive reservoir of cold, constantly radiating frigid temperatures up. Even if you managed to warm the air inside your house, which was nearly impossible, the floor remained bitterly cold, sucking heat from your body with every moment you stood or sat on it. This cold rising from below was relentless. It seeped up from the earth like a malevolent spectre, worming its way through the straw, into your bones, and directly into your very soul. If you dropped anything onto the floor during a winter night, congratulations, it was now part of the permafrost. Medieval peasants tried to fight this grim battle in a few ways. One method was layering thick mats of straw across the floor if you could afford it, or more realistically if you could steal enough of it from your neighbor's field without getting caught. You might have a decent insulating barrier, but straw flattened fast, compressed by the weight of people and animals walking on it day after day, and it got moldy even faster, especially when it absorbed moisture from the ground or from leaks in the roof. Within weeks, your insulation would be a compressed, damp, rotting mat that actually made things worse by trapping moisture against the ground. Some homes layered dried rushes onto the dirt instead. Every so often they would throw fresh rushes on top without cleaning out the old ones. Over time this created a fascinating ecosystem of decomposing plants, fleas, lice, bits of food, animal droppings, and whatever mystery creatures decided to move in. It was basically medieval carpet padding. If your carpet was alive, slightly damp and smelled like a wet dog that had rolled in something dead, the bottom layer of rushes pressed against the cold earth would rot into a kind of compost. The middle layers would be damp and moldy. Only the top layer, if recently replaced, might be relatively dry, but walk on it for a few days, and it too would compress and disappear into the mess below. Beds, for those who had them, didn't solve much. They were usually little more than wooden frames packed with, you guessed it, more straw or hay. Instead of cozy mattresses, you had poking, shifting, crunchy layers that did little against the cold radiating from below. The wooden frame kept you slightly elevated off the ground, which helped marginally, but the straw mattress offered minimal insulation. Cold air flowed through the gaps in the woven straw. The wooden frame itself conducted cold from the floor it rested on. Tossing and turning wasn't about comfort. It was a desperate, awkward dance to keep blood flowing to your extremities and avoid freezing one side of your body while the other side roasted near the fire. The truth is, medieval peasants didn't conquer the icy ground so much as learn to live uncomfortably above it. A good night's sleep wasn't about dreams or softness. It was about waking up with all your toes still attached and having feeling in your fingers. And if you could pull that off, hey, you were doing better than most. The smoking heart of home. If medieval homes had a single hero during winter, it wasn't the roof or the walls, or even the brave layers of dirt and dung insulation. It was the hearth, a crackling, stubborn fire pit that served as the only real defense against the cold, the darkness and the general gloom of medieval life. At the center of nearly every peasant home was a simple fire. No fireplace with a fancy stone mantel, no neat chimney sweeping the smoke skyward. Instead, you had a basic pit or pile of stones, some half-burned logs, and enough smoke pouring into the room to make you wonder if you were slowly becoming a ham. That's right, most homes didn't even have chimneys. Smoke just kind of did its best. It drifted out through small holes in the roof, cracks in the walls, or right into your lungs if it was feeling lazy that evening. The hearth was typically positioned in the center of the single room, though sometimes it was placed against one wall. The central location actually made sense. It allowed heat to radiate in all directions, warming theoretically the entire space. But it also meant smoke had to find its own way out, and smoke, being smoke, took its sweet time doing so. The fire pit itself was often just a shallow depression in the dirt floor, sometimes lined with stones if you were fortunate. The stones served multiple purposes. They helped contain the fire, they absorbed and radiated heat even after the flames died down, and they provided a relatively stable surface for cooking pots. Around this pit, the entire life of the family revolved. It was the kitchen where meals were prepared. It was the workshop where tools were repaired and crafts were practiced. It was the social center where stories were told and decisions were made. And most critically, it was the source of heat and light that made survival possible. The smoke situation wasn't ideal for breathing or your overall lifespan. Chronic respiratory problems were endemic among medieval peasants. Coughing, wheezing, and lung diseases were simply accepted as part of life. The constant irritation of smoke probably shortened lives by years, if not decades. But on the bright side, and medieval peasants were experts at finding bright sides, it did a great job of fumigating fleas and other unwanted guests. Who needs pest control when you're marinating in smoke? The acrid smoke killed insects, discouraged rodents somewhat, and even helped preserve food hung from the rafters. The smell inside these homes must have been extraordinary. A complex mixture of wood smoke, cooking food, unwashed bodies, animal dung, damp wool, and whatever was decomposing in the rush flooring. To modern noses, it would be overwhelming. To medieval noses, it was simply hope. No chimney, just hope. The hearth wasn't just about warmth, either. It was the kitchen, the light source, and sometimes even the medieval version of a television. People sat around the fire, telling stories, gossiping, or just staring into the flames because, frankly, there wasn't much else to do after sunset. Entertainment options were limited. No books for most people who couldn't read anyway. No games beyond simple dice or board games if you were lucky. No music unless someone in the village had an instrument and the skill to play it. So the fire became the evening's entertainment. Watching the flames dance, seeing shapes in the embers, listening to the crackle and pop of burning wood. It was hypnotic, meditative, and utterly necessary for maintaining sanity during the long, dark winter months. Stories passed down through generations were shared around the hearth. Children learned the history of their family, their village, their world, all through oral tradition. All around the fire, religious tales, folk stories, practical wisdom, and community gossip all flowed in those smoky evening hours. The fire also served as the community clock of sorts. Different stages of the fire, the initial blaze, the steady burning, the gradual dying into embers, marked the progression of evening into night. When the fire burned bright, it was time for work and socializing. As it died down, it was time for sleep. Keeping the fire alive wasn't just a nice idea, it was mandatory. Letting the fire die out at night was like putting up a sign for the cold to come in and finish you off. Plus, reigniting a fire in winter wasn't as easy as striking a match, a technology that wouldn't exist for centuries. You had to work with flint, steel, kindling, and more prayers than you'd ever offered before. The flint and steel method required skill and patience. You'd strike the steel against the flint at just the right angle with just the right force to create a spark. That spark had to land on a piece of char cloth or very dry tinder fungus, dried moss, or shredded bark. Then you'd carefully blow on it, nursing the tiny ember into a small flame, then gradually adding larger pieces of kindling, until finally, you could add proper firewood. In ideal conditions, dry materials, skilled hands, no wind, this might take 5 to 10 minutes. In winter conditions, cold fingers, damp materials, drafty room, it could take much longer, and if you were trying to do this in the middle of the night, half frozen and exhausted, it could be nearly impossible. That's why letting the fire go completely out was considered a serious failure. It meant the family would wake to a freezing house with no immediate source of warmth. It meant someone would have to struggle with flint and steel while everyone else shivered. And it meant losing precious hours of warmth during the coldest part of the night. Fire is everything. Kitchen, light, survival. Everyone in the family had a duty: stoking the flames, watching the embers, adding peat, sticks, or if you were lucky, a precious piece of dry wood. It was a constant battle between human persistence and the smothering cold that wanted nothing more than to snuff you out. Fuel management was a serious concern. Wood, the most desirable fuel, wasn't always available. Forests were often controlled by nobles who restricted access. Gathering deadwood was allowed in some places, forbidden in others. Peasants who were caught taking wood from the Lord's forest could face severe punishment. So many peasants burned whatever they could find. Peat, partially decomposed plant material dug from bogs, was a common fuel in some regions. It burned slowly and provided steady heat, but it was smoky and smelly. Dried animal dung, shaped into cakes and dried, was another option. It burned surprisingly well, though the smell was predictable. Straw, dried grass, and crop stubble could be burned in desperation, though they burned quickly and provided little lasting heat. Any wood scraps, branches, roots, bark were hoarded carefully. Every piece of furniture that broke, every tool handle that cracked, everything wooden that was no longer useful would eventually end up in the fire. Children were often tasked with gathering kindling and small fuel. They'd scour the nearby fields and forests for anything burnable, competing with children from neighboring families for the same scarce resources. A good find, a fallen branch, a clump of peat was cause for celebration. The fire's hunger was endless. Feeding it required constant attention and constant effort. Too much fuel too quickly and you'd waste precious resources. Too little and the fire would die. Finding the balance was an art passed down through generations. At night, the responsibility of watching the fire often fell to different family members in rotation. Someone had to wake periodically to add fuel to ensure the fire didn't die completely. This disrupted sleep patterns, but it was necessary. The alternative was waking to a dead fire and a house already dropping toward lethal temperatures. The hearth didn't guarantee survival, but without it, survival was downright impossible. It was a smoky, sputtering, often disappointing little fire. But in a medieval winter, it was the beating heart of hope. The glow of the flames, however weak, represented life continuing despite the cold trying to extinguish it. The warmth, however inadequate, was the thin line between survival and freezing to death. And the light, however dim and flickering, pushed back the psychological darkness of those endless winter nights. In a world where so much was beyond human control, the weather, the seasons, disease, hunger, the fire was something you could influence. You could tend it, feed it, protect, and in doing so, you were actively participating in your own survival. That simple act of maintaining a fire carried profound psychological weight. It meant you hadn't given up. It meant you were still fighting, and as long as the embers glowed, hope remained alive. Never let the flames die. If there was one thing medieval peasants feared more than running out of ale, it was letting the fire go out overnight. Without that warm, flickering lifeline, the cold would creep in faster than a tax collector after harvest. And in the dead of winter, restarting a fire from scratch wasn't just inconvenient, it could be deadly. Matches didn't exist yet. Lighters, rekindling a fire meant striking flint and steel together, praying for a single precious spark. and then coddling that spark with tender love and whatever dry kindling you hadn't already burned days ago. Imagine trying to do all this in the freezing dark, half asleep with frozen fingers. Now add a hungry wolf howling in the distance for extra motivation. The pressure was real. The stakes were life and death, and failure meant your family might not survive until morning. The fear of the fire going out was so profound that it shaped nightly routine. Before anyone could think about sleep, the fire had to be secured. This wasn't a casual task. It was a ritual performed with the seriousness of a religious ceremony. Children learned from their earliest years that the fire was sacred. They watched their parents and grandparents perform the banking ritual every evening, and they understood implicitly that this simple act stood between them and freezing to death before sunrise. The anxiety was pervasive. Even after banking the fire, family members would wake periodically throughout the night to check on it. A parent might rise 2 or 3 times, carefully approaching the hearth, looking for the telltale glow of embers beneath the ash. Finding that glow brought relief. Finding only cold ash brought panic. Stories circulated through villages of families who had lost their fire on the coldest nights. Some managed to borrow coals from neighbors, if they could reach them safely through the dark and cold. Others weren't so fortunate. The cautionary tales served to reinforce the absolute importance of fire maintenance, the ancient art of ember preservation. So peasants got smart. They banked the fire. No, not in a cozy savings account. Banking meant carefully burying the embers under a mound of ash right before bed. The ash acted like a blanket, insulating the glowing coals and keeping them alive just barely until morning. If you did it right, you could stroll over at sunrise, poke the pile a little, add fresh wood, and voila, fire without the frostbite. But if you did it wrong, well, let's just say mornings got a whole lot colder and a whole lot grumpier. The technique of fire banking was more complex than it might seem. It required understanding the nature of fire, heat, and combustion, knowledge gained through trial and error over countless generations. The process typically went like this. First, you'd let the fire burn down until you had a good bed of hot coals rather than active flames. Flames consume fuel quickly and don't retain heat as well as coal. The goal was to have coals that were hot enough to survive the night, but not so active that they'd burn through your fuel supply before morning. Next, you'd arrange the coals carefully. Some people gathered them into a compact pile in the center of the hearth. Others spread them slightly to maximize the surface area that could be covered by ash. Different families had different methods, each swearing their technique was superior. Then came the ash layer. You'd carefully scoop ash, the fine powdery residue from previous fires, and gently mound it over the coals. The ash layer needed to be thick enough to insulate effectively, typically 3 to 4 inches, but not so thick that it completely smothered the coals and extinguished them. This was the tricky part. Too little ash, and the coals would cool too quickly or be exposed to drafts that would make them burn too fast. Too much ash, and you'd cut off the oxygen supply entirely, killing the coals. The balance had to be perfect. Some experienced firebankers would leave a small breathing hole in the ash mound, a narrow channel that allowed just enough air to reach the coals to keep them alive without letting them burn active. Others sealed the ash completely, relying on the tiny amount of air trapped within the mound. Temperature and humidity affected the process. On particularly cold nights, you might need a thicker ash layer. On damp nights, damp ash could actually help by creating a more impermeable barrier that retained heat better. Family arguments over fire techniques. Firebanking was an art passed down from parent to child like a prized family recipe. Everyone had their own little secret. Some said use dry ash only. Others insisted a bit of dampness was key. Some packed the embers tight. Others let them breathe. You could practically start a medieval argument just by suggesting a better firebanking method. It was the ancient version of arguing over barbecue techniques, just with slightly higher survival stakes. These weren't trivial disagreements. When survival depended on the fire lasting through the night, people took their methods serious. Families developed techniques that worked reliably in their particular circumstances, their type of fuel, their style of hearth, their regional climate, and defended those methods fiercely. Young people marrying into new families sometimes caused tension when they brought different firebanking techniques from their childhood homes. "That's not how we do it" could be fighting words when it came to something as critical as fire maintenance. Village elders who had successfully banked fires for decades were respected sources of wisdom. Their advice was sought out especially by young families facing their first winter alone. These elders would often check on younger families during the coldest months, offering guidance and sometimes assistance when fires were struggling. Regional variations existed too. Areas with different types of fuel, peat versus wood, hardwood versus softwood, developed different optimal techniques. Coastal areas with damp, salty air required different approaches than inland valleys with dry, cold. Sometimes banking the fire wasn't enough. A howling wind might sneak through a crack and snuff it out anyway, or a clumsy sheep might stumble into the hearth. Yes, it happened. That's why some families took turns getting up in the night to check the coals. Basically the medieval equivalent of sleepwalking to the thermostat. The person assigned to night watch duty, often rotating among the older children and adults, had a critical responsibility. They'd rise in the darkness, carefully feel their way to the hearth, without light, because you couldn't waste fuel on a torch just for checking the fire, and assess the situation. If the ash mound felt warm to the touch, all was well. If it felt merely lukewarm, they might gently add a small piece of fuel and carefully adjust the ash. If it felt cold, panic mode activate. They'd have to carefully excavate the ash to find any surviving embers, blow gently on them to encourage them to glow brighter, add dry tinder, and nurse the fire back to life, all while trying not to wake the entire family with the commotion. In the end, firebanking was less about mastering nature and more about buying just a few more precious hours of warmth. And if you woke up to even a single surviving ember, that was your victory, right there, enough to face another day of battling the cold. The morning ritual of reviving the fire was its own practiced art. The person who rose first, often the mother of the family, would approach the hearth with hope and trepidation. Using a stick or a poker, they'd carefully disturb the ash mound, looking for the red glow of living coals beneath. Finding that glow was like finding treasure. With careful attention, those coals could be exposed to fresh air, fed with dry tinder and kindling, and gradually coaxed back into a proper fire. Within minutes, flames would be dancing again, and the house would begin its slow climb towards something approaching warmth. But finding only dead, grey ash, that meant trouble. Cold, hungry family members would wake to no fire, no warmth, and the grim prospect of trying to start a fire from scratch with numb fingers and limited resources. It meant the day was starting badly, and everyone knew. The successful maintenance of the fire through the night was thus not just practical, it was emotional. It represented security, competence, and the family's ability to protect itself. A strong fire in the morning meant hope, a dead fire meant the more the warmer. In medieval times, the phrase "the more the merrier" wasn't just about parties. It was a winter survival tactic. When the fire sputtered and the freezing winds whistled through every crack, there was one surefire source of warmth: each other. And if that meant sleeping cheek to cheek with your entire family, neighbors, livestock, and possibly a very confused goose, so be it. The science behind this was simple. Even if medieval peasants didn't understand it in modern terms, the human body generates heat constantly through metabolism. An average adult produces roughly as much heat as a 100-watt light bulb. In isolation, much of that heat is lost to the surrounding cold air. But when multiple bodies huddle together, they create a shared microclimate where combined heat is retained within the group. This wasn't a strategy born from comfort or preference. It was born from the grim observation that people who slept alone on the coldest nights were more likely to freeze to death. People who slept in groups survived. The lesson was clear, and it was followed without question. The practice of communal sleeping went far beyond just sharing a bed. It was a complete reorganization of living space and social norms around the singular goal of thermal survival. Privacy, personal space, individual comfort. These were luxuries no one could afford when temperatures plummeted. Villages and extended families understood this implicitly. On the very coldest nights, it wasn't uncommon for multiple families to gather in one home, the one with the best maintained roof, the strongest walls, or simply the one with the most bodies already present. Safety in numbers applied to temperature as much as to defense against wolves or raiders. Sleeping in piles, forget about personal space. Privacy wasn't even a concept. On the coldest nights, the goal wasn't comfort. It was don't wake up frozen to the floor. Entire households piled into the warmest corner of the house, wrapped in whatever scraps of cloth they could find, and formed what could best be described as a desperate, snoring human lasagna. Younger kids squeezed in between parents, grandparents snuggled under the outer layer, and if Cousin Ethel showed up unexpectedly, well, there was always room for one more. The logistics of this arrangement were both practical and complex. The sleeping area was typically the section of the room closest to the hearth, where residual heat from the fire provided the maximum benefit. The floor in this area might be covered with the best, driest straw available. Every available blanket, cloak and piece of fabric was pulled together as communal bedding. The family would arrange themselves strategic. The very young and the very old, being most vulnerable to cold, were placed in the middle of the group where they'd be surrounded by warmth on all sides. Adults and older children formed the outer layers, their larger bodies acting as insulation for those in the center. This wasn't random piling. It was engineered, refined through generations of trial and error. Families knew exactly how to arrange themselves for maximum thermal efficiency. Larger bodies on the outside, smaller bodies protected in the middle. Those who tended to run warmer distributed evenly throughout the group. Those who generated less body heat, placed in the most protected positions. Limbs intertwined awkwardly but necessarily. Arms tucked around bodies, legs overlapping. Backs pressed against bellies. What would seem impossibly uncomfortable in normal circumstances became standard practice. You accepted another person's elbow in your ribs because that elbow helped keep you alive. The breathing of multiple people created additional warmth and humidity within the huddle. Exhaled breath contains heat and moisture. In a tight group, this created a warmer microclimate that benefited everyone. Yes, it also meant breathing air that others had already breathed. But again, survival trumped comfort every time. Fighting for the warm middle spot. If you were lucky, you got to sleep in the middle, where body heat radiated from all sides. If you were unlucky, you were on the edge, the medieval equivalent of sleeping next to the door of a meat locker. And woe to the person who moved too much during the night. You shift once to get comfortable, and suddenly you've knocked Aunt Maud into the freezing draft by the wall. Congratulations, you're now the family villain. The politics of sleeping positions could create genuine family tension. Everyone understood that the middle was warmest and the edges were coldest. The middle meant survival with minimal suffering. The edges meant waking up multiple times throughout the night, chilled to the bone, possibly with frostbitten extremity. Social hierarchies emerged around sleeping arrangements. The parents, particularly the mother, often claimed central positions by virtue of their importance to family survival. Young children, as mentioned, were protected in warm spots, but older children, adolescents, and less favored family members might find themselves relegated to the periphery. Being assigned an edge position wasn't just uncomfortable, it could be genuinely dangerous. Those on the outside often woke with numb fingers and toes, sometimes with mild frostbite. They'd spend much of the night shivering, unable to sleep deeply, their bodies in mild shock from the cold. Some people tried to improve their edge positions by wearing extra layers or by keeping their cloaks wrapped tightly around themselves. Others would attempt to burrow deeper into the pile during the night, inadvertently pushing others toward the edge. This could lead to midnight confrontations with someone hissing angrily in the darkness, "Stop pushing, stay on your side." Movement was a constant issue. Sleeping in such close proximity meant that any movement by one person affected everyone. Someone trying to adjust their position might accidentally elbow their neighbor, who would jolt awake and accidentally knee someone else, creating a ripple effect of disruption throughout the entire group. Snoring was another problem. With multiple people breathing heavily in confined space, the cacophony could be intense, but you couldn't exactly banish a snorer to another room. There was only one room. And besides, losing even one warm body from the group meant everyone was colder. Sometimes even bedding was shared, a communal straw mattress that slowly flattened under the nightly weight of multiple generations. And because hygiene wasn't exactly winning any awards back then, let's just say it wasn't the most fragrant sleeping arrangement. But hey, when it's you versus frostbite, you stop being picky. Body odor was pervasive. Medieval people didn't bathe frequently, especially not in winter when accessing water meant breaking through ice and heating it was fuel intensive. Clothes were rarely washed. Combined with poor diet, lack of dental care, and the smoke-infused smell that permeated everything, the olfactory experience of communal sleeping was intense. But smell was a low-priority concern. You could tolerate unpleasant odors, you couldn't tolerate freezing to death. So everyone ignored the smell, or more accurately, became so accustomed to it that they no longer noticed. Body heat wasn't just nice, it was strategic. Some medieval guides even recommended deliberately arranging the strongest, warmest people on the outside of the group, like human shields against the cold. Babies and frail elders were tucked deep in the center, treated like the precious little heat generators they were. Adult men, typically the largest and warmest members of the family, often took positions on the edges, as both a protective measure and a practical one. Their larger body mass meant they could withstand edge positions better than smaller family members. It was an unspoken sacrifice, accepting discomfort so that the most vulnerable could survive. Women, especially mothers who were pregnant or nursing, were also given priority for warmer positions. Their survival was critical to the family's continuation, and their bodies were already stressed by the demands of reproduction in harsh conditions. This wasn't just about survival though. Over time it became part of daily life, part of family bonding. Long winter nights huddled together led to storytelling, singing, and undoubtedly some very interesting conversations muffled under a shared wool blanket. In the darkness, with nothing to do but wait for dawn, family stories were shared. Tales of ancestors, legends of heroes, gossip about neighbors, plans for the coming spring. These conversations, conducted in whispers to avoid disturbing those trying to sleep, created and reinforced family bonds. Children learned their family history during these nights. They heard about their grandparents' youth, about harder winters that had been survived, about family members who had died. They learned practical wisdom, moral lessons, and cultural values, all transmitted orally in the intimate space of the communal sleeping pile. Songs were sometimes sung softly, lullabies for restless children, prayers for protection, folk songs that everyone knew. Music created a sense of shared experience and provided comfort in the darkness. Physical closeness also created emotional closeness. The forced intimacy of sleeping so near to one another, night after night, created bonds that modern families with their separate bedrooms and personal space might find hard to imagine. You couldn't maintain emotional distance from people whose breathing you heard every night, whose warmth kept you alive. So next time your sibling steals your blanket or your dog hogs the bed, just remember, at least you're not fighting for elbow space between a snoring uncle and a particularly judgmental goat. The intimacy was sometimes too much. Couples with older children had virtually no privacy for intimate relations. Arguments couldn't be taken to separate rooms to cool off. Personal grievances had to be managed within the context of this forced proximity. But the alternative, sleeping alone and freezing, was simply not an option. So people adapted. They developed social conventions for managing conflict in close quarters. They learned to forgive quickly because holding grudges was exhausting when you had to sleep pressed against the person you were angry with. The communal sleeping strategy represented both the best and the challenging aspects of medieval peasant life. It was collective survival at its most fundamental, everyone sacrificing individual comfort for the group's benefit. It was family bonds, strengthened through literal physical closeness, but it was also exhausting, uncomfortable, and occasionally frustrating. Yet it worked. Families survived the winter nights, not through advanced technology or superior resources, but through the simple, profound act of holding each other close, sharing warmth, and refusing to let the cold take them.
Cows, goats, and chickens indoors. If you thought modern roommates were a challenge, medieval peasants would like to introduce you to their winter housemates. Cows, goats, pigs, chickens, basically anything with a pulse and a little bit of body heat. Bringing animals indoors wasn't just a quirky village tradition, it was vital for survival. Livestock generated warmth, and in a poorly insulated hovel where the wind howled louder than your stomach, every little degree mattered. Plus, if your goat shared a wall with you, it was slightly less likely to get stolen by a neighbor in the dead of night. Two birds, one stinky stone. The practice of housing animals indoors during winter had deep, practical roots. Animals are warm-blooded creatures that generate significant heat through their metabolism. A cow, for example, produces as much heat as several adult humans. A goat or pig contributes meaningfully to warming a small space. Even chickens, small as they are, add warmth when grouped together. But it wasn't just about warmth. Livestock represented a family's wealth and future. A cow provided milk, a critical source of nutrition. Goats offered milk and occasionally meat. Pigs could be slaughtered for food. Chickens produced eggs. Losing any of these animals to winter cold, predators, or thieves could be catastrophic. Outdoor animal shelters, the crude barns and sheds that did exist, offered minimal protection from severe winter weather. Animals housed outdoors often died from exposure, or at minimum, suffered enough that their productivity dropped. A cow that was too cold produced less milk. Chickens stopped laying eggs in extreme cold, so the solution was obvious. Bring them inside, share the meager warmth of the fire, protect them from predators and thieves, ensure their survival, and by extension the family's survival. The transition happened every autumn as winter approached. Animals that had grazed outdoors during the warmer months were gradually brought into the house at night, then eventually kept indoors continuously as weather worsened. The smell of survival. At night, the house became a chaotic living furnace. Chickens nested in corners, pigs snorted near the hearth,
and cows lounged luxuriously against the walls, chewing cud like they paid rent. It wasn't glamorous, far from it. If you've ever been stuck in a car on a summer road trip with someone who forgot to shower, imagine that. But it's winter, and there's literally nowhere else to go. The smells, legendary. By springtime, the perfume of a shared winter was something fierce. You didn't need to light a candle. Your nostrils were already on a wild ride. Let's talk honestly about the smell. The combination of unwashed humans, smoke from the fire, rotting floor rushes, and multiple animals all enclosed in a small, poorly ventilated space, created an olfactory environment that defies modern description. Cows and goats urinated and defecated regularly. Pigs, despite their unfair reputation as filthy animals, actually prefer cleanliness, but had no choice in these confined quarters. Chickens dropped feces continuously from their roosting spot. All of this waste accumulated on the floor, mixed with the straw and rushes, and created a fermenting, reeking mess. The ammonia from urine, particularly in a closed environment, would have been intense. It irritated eyes and respiratory systems already compromised by smoke. It permeated clothing, hair, and skin. There was no escaping it. But medieval peasants developed a selective nose. They didn't complain much because they knew one uncomfortable truth. The more animals inside, the fewer frozen toes in the morning. The human capacity for olfactory adaptation is remarkable. After constant exposure to strong smells, the nose essentially stops registering them as intensely. What would make a modern person gag and flee was simply background reality for medieval peasants. They didn't notice it anymore because they lived in it continuously. Besides, everyone smelled the same. When you and all your neighbors live with animals, wear unwashed clothes, and rarely bathe, there's no social stigma to body odor, because universal odor is just normal. Certain animals even had prime spots. Cows, being the biggest and warmest, usually took center stage near the family. Goats were allowed closer in for their warmth. And because goats, being goats, would find a way inside anyway. Goats are notoriously clever and persistent. If you tried to keep a goat outside on a cold night, it would bleat incessantly, push against doors, and generally make such a nuisance of itself that letting it in became easier than keeping it out. So goats won indoor privileges partly through sheer stubbornness. Chickens roosted in rafters or old baskets suspended from ceiling beams. This kept them away from predators, the family cat if they had one, or rats, and allowed their body heat to rise and contribute to warming the upper air of the room. Of course, this also meant that chicken droppings rained down periodically from above, adding yet another hazard to medieval indoor life. Pigs, well, pigs didn't care. They plopped down wherever they pleased, probably right in the middle of the floor, blocking the main pathway through the room and forcing everyone to step over or around them constantly. Pigs are intelligent and social animals. They quickly learned that the warmest spot was near the fire, and they'd stake out these prime locations with possessive determination. Moving a comfortable pig was a significant undertaking, often requiring multiple people to literally push the stubborn animal away from its chosen spot. Medieval mornings could be full of surprises. Of course, sharing your bedroom with livestock wasn't without hazard. Imagine drifting off peacefully, only to be rudely awakened by a chicken, deciding your hair makes a good perch, or stepping barefoot into something suspicious first thing in the morning. Yes, medieval mornings could be full of surprises. Animal-related awakenings were countless and varied. A cow might low loudly in the middle of the night, startling everyone awake. A pig might root around near your sleeping area, snuffling and snorting in search of food scraps. A goat might decide your wool blanket looked delicious and start nibbling on it while you were still wrapped in. Chickens, being creatures of habit, would begin stirring and clucking at the first hint of dawn, which in winter meant very early by modern standards. Their noise would wake the humans, who would then begin their own day, whether they felt rested or not. The physical hazards were real. A cow's hoof, if stepped on accidentally, could break human toes. A startled pig could bite. Goats could headbutt if they felt crowded or annoyed. And navigating a dark room filled with sleeping animals while trying to tend the fire or answer a call of nature was treacherous. Tripping over a sleeping pig and falling into the animal could result in a squealing commotion that woke everyone, to the great annoyance of family members who had finally managed to fall asleep despite the cold and discomfort. And yes, stepping in animal waste was essentially inevitable. The floor was covered in it. There was no avoiding it in the darkness. You learned to walk carefully, shuffle your feet to test the ground ahead, and accept that your feet would never truly be clean during winter months. Still, despite the noise, the smells and the occasional hoof to the ribs, peasants understood the simple math. Cold kills, and cows cuddle whether they want to or not. In the battle against winter's icy fingers, a warm, slightly slobbery cow breath was often the deciding factor between life and death. The animals probably weren't thrilled with the arrangement either. Cows are herd animals that prefer open space. Being confined in a small, smoky room went against their nature. They'd shift restlessly, knock things over with their tails, and generally make their discomfort known. But they also benefited from the warmth of the fire and the protection from winter storm. A cow housed indoors during a blizzard that killed outdoor livestock survived to provide milk and labor in the spring. So the arrangement, uncomfortable as it was, served everyone's interest. Children growing up in this environment developed an intimate familiarity with animals that modern urban children rarely experience. They learned animal behavior through constant observation. They understood each animal's personality, moods, and this knowledge proved valuable throughout their lives, as they managed livestock themselves in adulthood. The animals also provided a kind of companionship. In the long dark hours of winter nights, the presence of livestock, the sound of a cow chewing cud, the soft clucking of settling chickens, even the snorts of a sleeping pig created a sense of life and vitality that helped combat the oppressive darkness and cold. Medieval peasants didn't sentimentalize their animals the way modern pet owners might, but they certainly developed bonds with creatures they lived alongside so intimate. A cow that had shared your living space for 5 winters wasn't just livestock, it was almost part of the family, even if it would eventually be sold or slaughtered when necessary. The spring transition, when animals were finally moved back outdoors, must have been a blessed relief. The house could be thoroughly cleaned, or at least the worst of the accumulated filth could be removed. Fresh air could circulate, the smell would gradually dissipate, but then the following autumn, the cycle would begin again. Because in the arithmetic of medieval survival, discomfort was always preferable to death, and a smelly, crowded house full of animals was infinitely better than a clean, empty house, where everyone froze.
Medieval fashion, survival edition. In medieval winters, fashion wasn't about looking good, it was about not dying. Peasants weren't flipping through the latest trends. They were layering up like they were preparing for battle against the Grim Reaper himself. The rule was simple. If you owned it, you wore it. Sometimes all at once. First, the basic undertunic, a scratchy, probably not too clean linen shirt. Over that, a thicker woolen tunic. Then, another, if you had it. Add some leggings that sagged at the knees. A rough cloak draped over your shoulders, and if you were really lucky, a patched-up sheepskin thrown on top like a prize trophy. Congratulations, you are now approximately 10% warmer, and 90% itchier. The medieval wardrobe was minimalist by necessity, not choice. Most peasants owned only a few garments total: a linen undergarment, 1 or 2 woolen tunics, a cloak, and perhaps some leg wrappings or leggings. Wealthy peasants might have slightly more, but ownership of multiple outfits was generally reserved for merchants and nobility. Winter meant wearing every single item simultaneously. The underlayer, usually linen if you could afford it, or coarse wool if not, sat directly against the skin. Linen, despite being lightweight, actually provides decent insulation when combined with outer layers. It wicks moisture away from the body, which is important because sweat trapped against skin in cold weather increases heat loss. Over the underlayer went 1 or more woolen tunic. Wool is an exceptional insulating material even when slightly damp. The crimped structure of wool fibers traps air, creating insulating pockets. Medieval wool was typically coarse and scratchy, nothing like the soft merino wool we have today, but it was effective. These tunics were usually long, reaching to mid-thigh or knee, and were belted at the waist. The belt served practical purposes. It prevented the garment from flapping open and letting cold air in, and it created a slight blousing effect that trapped additional warm air around the torso. Leg coverings varied. Some peasants wrapped strips of cloth around their legs in a crisscrossing pattern, a technique that provided insulation and also offered some protection against scratches and bites when working outdoors. Others wore actual leggings made from wool, or occasionally leather, though leather was expensive and usually beyond a peasant's means. Over everything went the cloak. This was often the most substantial garment a peasant owned, a large rectangle or semicircle of thick wool that could be wrapped around the body, held closed with a pin or tie, and pulled up over the head in bad weather. The cloak was your coat, your blanket, your shelter from wind and rain, your ground cover when sitting, and sometimes your shroud if you died. Wearing your entire wardrobe, boots were a luxury. Many peasants wrapped their feet in layers of cloth or old rags, and stuffed them into wooden clogs. If the cold still bit through, well,
You just added another rag and hoped you didn't lose a toe. And forget about washing all these layers. Washing your clothes in the middle of winter meant dragging them to a frozen stream, smashing through the ice, and then waiting 2 days for your only shirt to dry. If it didn't just freeze into a tragic shirt cycle. Most peasants wisely decided that smelling like a mix of smoke, sweat and sheep was a small price to pay for not freezing solid. Footwear, or the lack thereof, was a serious vulnerability. Feet are extremities that lose heat quickly. In medieval winter, keeping feet warm and dry was nearly impossible for peasants. The wealthy had leather boots, carefully constructed and relatively water-resistant. Peasants had improvisation. Some had simple leather shoes, basically pouches of leather tied around the foot. These offered minimal protection and quickly became soaked in wet conditions. Wooden clogs, raised wooden platforms with a leather or cloth strap across the top, kept feet elevated off the frozen ground and out of mud and snow, but they offered no insulation and were difficult to walk in on uneven terrain. Still, they were better than nothing. Many peasants simply wrapped their feet in wool cloth or stuffed their feet with straw before putting on whatever footwear they had. The straw provided cushioning and insulation but became compressed and useless quickly. It also attracted moisture and could actually make feet colder when wet. Chilblains, painful inflammation caused by exposure to cold and moisture, were endemic. Frostbite was common. Some peasants survived winters at the cost of toes or parts of their feet. A severe case of frostbite might mean permanent disability, rendering a person unable to work effectively, and thus reducing their value in a society where physical labor was currency. The washing dilemma was real. Medieval people understood that clothes needed cleaning occasionally, but winter made it nearly impossible. Water sources froze. Heating enough water to wash clothes consumed precious fuel. Wet clothes could take days to dry, and in the meantime you had nothing else to wear. So clothes went unwashed for months. The accumulation of sweat, body oils, smoke, dirt, food stains and miscellaneous filth created garments that were stiff, discolored, and pungent. But everyone's clothes were in the same condition, so again, no social stigma. The stink strategy. Interestingly, the dirt and grease buildup had a bonus feature: insulation. That grimy layer locked in body heat. It was like a medieval Gore-Tex jacket, just smellier and far less socially acceptable today. The science behind this is actually sound. Body oils and dirt accumulated in the fabric fibers created an additional barrier against wind and cold. The oils, being hydrophobic, also provided some water resistance. A well-worn unwashed wool garment actually performed better than a freshly laundered one in terms of insulation and weather protection. Medieval people probably didn't understand the chemistry, but they understood the practical reality. Their dirty clothes kept them warmer than clean ones would have, so dirt as insulation became an unspoken survival strategy. Hats, scarves and gloves were prized treasure. A simple woolen cap could mean the difference between making it through the night or waking up with hair frozen to the wall. Gloves were often homemade from whatever scraps of leather or fabric people could scrounge, sometimes looking more like sad puppet costumes than anything fashionable. Head coverings were critical because the human body loses a significant amount of heat through the scalp. A wool cap or hood, kept on even while sleeping, dramatically improved warmth. Women typically wore wimples or hoods that covered head, neck and sometimes shoulders, offering excellent protection against cold. Hand protection was even more precious. Working with frozen numb fingers was not only painful but dangerous. You couldn't grip tools properly, couldn't feel injuries when they occurred, and risked frostbite. But gloves were expensive and difficult to make. Mittens, which allow fingers to share warmth, were more common and more practical than individual finger gloves. Some peasants made mittens from old wool scraps or even rabbit fur if they could trap enough rabbits. Others simply wrapped cloth around their hands and hoped for the best. Children were especially swaddled until they resembled overstuffed turnips waddling awkwardly around the house. The goal was to trap as much precious body heat as possible. Style, elegance, never heard of them. Warmth was the real medieval flex. Children's clothing followed the same principles as adult clothing, but with the added challenge of growth. Children outgrew clothes quickly, but new clothes were expensive and time-consuming to make, so children's garments were made deliberately large and cinched with belts or ties. As the child grew, the garment was loosened. When finally outgrown, it was passed down to the next younger sibling. then eventually cut up for patches or rags. The layering of children was particularly important because children's smaller bodies lost heat more quickly than adults. A child experiencing hypothermia might not wake up in the morning, so parents bundled their children aggressively, wrapping them in layers until they could barely move their arm. The sight of these over-bundled children stumbling around the cramped house must have been both endearing and slightly comical. Round little wool-wrapped creatures shuffling carefully, arms sticking out at angles, unable to bend properly due to the bulk of their clothing. So the next time you complain about layering up for a chilly day, just remember, medieval peasants walked around wearing half their wardrobe at once, looking like lumpy laundry bags and counting themselves lucky for it. The modern fashion philosophy of dress in layers has its roots in medieval survival strategy. The difference is that modern layering is optional. We can remove layers when we enter heated buildings. Medieval layering was permanent until spring. You wore everything, all the time, and you didn't take it off until temperatures rose enough that you wouldn't immediately freeze without it. The gradual shedding of layers as spring approached must have been a blessed relief, literally lightening the physical burden that had been carried for months. But even then, peasants were cautious. Removing too many layers too soon during an unexpected cold snap could be fatal. So the layers came off slowly, gradually, carefully, just as they had been added in autumn. Clothing wasn't just fabric in medieval times, it was survival technology. As crucial as fire or shelter, the garments that kept you alive through winter deserved respect, care, and yes, even affection. That filthy, stinking layers upon layers assemblage was your armor against death, and it did its job remarkably well, all things considered.
Dirt as insulation. In the medieval peasant playbook, dirt wasn't just something you scrubbed off. It was practically a survival tool. As it turns out, getting grimy wasn't a sign you'd given up on life. It was tactical, strategic, dare we say, genius. See, winter posed a very specific problem: heat loss. Clean clothes, especially freshly laundered linen, were surprisingly terrible at keeping you warm. They were breathable, sure, but when the air temperature hovered somewhere between hypothermia and instant regret, breathable wasn't exactly a selling point. That's where dirt came in. As peasants trudged through day after day without washing their clothing, layers of grime, natural body oils, and good old-fashioned mud began to build up on their tunics, cloaks, and leggings. Over time, this natural armor clogged the tiny gaps in the fabric, making clothes more wind-resistant. It was like medieval weatherproofing, just smellier. The transformation happened gradually. Fresh, clean wool fabric has a relatively open weave that allows air to pass through. This is wonderful in summer when you want ventilation. It's disastrous in winter when every breeze steals precious body heat. But as dirt, skin cells, body oils, and environmental grime accumulated, they filled in the microscopic spaces between wool fibers. The fabric became denser, tighter, more impermeable to wind. Air couldn't penetrate as easily, which meant cold couldn't rob you of warmth as quickly. The body oils were particularly important. Human skin constantly secretes sebum, an oily substance that protects skin from drying out. This sebum transferred to clothing, gradually coating the fiber. Being lipid-based, fatty, sebum is hydrophobic. It repels water. This meant that grimy, oil-soaked clothing actually provided a degree of water resistance that clean clothing lacked. When snow or rain fell on clean wool, it soaked in, making the garment heavy and cold. When the same precipitation fell on properly grimy wool, it beaded up and rolled off, or at least penetrated much more slowly. The wearer stayed drier and therefore warmer. Sure, you smelled like a goat who lost a bet, but guess what? You were warm. Why washing kills in winter? In fact, some medieval folks believed that washing yourself too often in winter could actually make you sick. Better to keep that protective holy filth barrier intact. This belief, while based on incomplete understanding of medicine, wasn't entirely wrong. The process of bathing in winter was genuinely dangerous. You had to heat water consuming precious fuel, strip off your warm clothing, exposing yourself to cold, wet your body, dramatically increasing heat loss, and then somehow dry off and redress before hypothermia set in. Many people who bathed in winter did get sick, not because cleanliness was unhealthy, but because the bathing process itself was risky. They might catch a chill that developed into pneumonia. They might not dry thoroughly and end up with damp clothing against their skin all day. They might use up so much firewood heating bath water that they couldn't keep the house warm afterward. So the correlation between bathing and illness was real, even if the causation was misunderstood. Medieval people observed that bathing in winter often preceded sickness.
and they logically concluded that bathing caused sickness. The solution: don't bathe. Bathing was rare, laundry even rarer, and soap, when it existed, was reserved for serious occasions, like when the bishop showed up, or maybe right before you died. Soap existed in medieval times but was considered a luxury item. It was made through a laborious process involving animal fats and lye, produced from wood ash, and it required skill to make properly. Most peasants couldn't afford to buy soap and didn't have the resources to make it themselves, so they simply went without. Occasional rinsing in cold water might happen during warmer months. In winter, even that minimal hygiene disappeared. The result was a population that was, by modern standards, spectacularly filthy. The protective grime layer, adding to the strategy, peasants layered their clothes without changing the ones underneath. You just threw your new layer on top of last month. Eventually you became a walking museum of the past 6 weeks. Every stain telling the heroic story of that one time I slipped in the mud, but didn't die. This archaeological approach to dressing created garments that were essentially biographical records. The innermost layer against the skin bore the marks of months of wear, sweat stains, skin oils, whatever you'd been eating, food dropped down your front, and the general accumulation of daily life. The next layer showed the marks of whatever work you'd been doing: mud from the fields, soot from the hearth, stains from handling livestock. The outer layers displayed environmental damage, rain stains, snow marks, the discoloration from months of exposure to smoke. Each layer was progressively less filthy, simply because it had less direct contact with your body and with your work, but none of it was clean by any modern definition. The psychological adaptation required to live this way is worth considering. Modern humans raised with daily showers and weekly laundry find the thought of unwashed clothes repulsive. But medieval peasants grew up in a world where everyone was equally dirty. It was the baseline, the normal state of existence. Children learned from birth that bodies and clothes smelled this way. They had no concept of clean as we understand it. Their normal was our nightmare, and they adapted to it psychologically, just as they adapted to cold, hunger and darkness. To outside observers, the occasional noble passing through, or travelers from distant lands, medieval peasants might have looked and smelled like they had completely given up on hygiene. But the peasants knew better. That grimy, crusty tunic was a thermal shield against death by frostbite. It wasn't glamorous, but neither was freezing to death because you wanted to smell like flowers. The irony is that medieval nobility, who could afford to wash their clothes and bathe more frequently, probably suffered more from cold than peasants did. Their clean garments offered less insulation. Their bathing exposed them to chills. Their delicate sensibilities made them less hardy in general. A nobleman in his freshly laundered linen shirt might have looked and smelled better than a peasant in his 6-month-old never-washed tunic. But in a genuine winter survival situation, the peasant's grubby layers would outperform the nobleman's clean ones. Besides, in a world where literally everyone stank to high heaven, you weren't offending anyone. Nose blindness was practically a way of life. Olfactory fatigue, the scientific term for nose blindness, is a real phenomenon. When exposed to a constant smell, the olfactory receptors in the nose adapt and stop sending strong signals to the brain. After a while you simply don't smell what you're continuously exposed. This meant that while a time traveler from the modern era would be overwhelmed by the stench of medieval life, medieval people themselves barely noticed it. Their own smell, their family's smell, their neighbor's smell, all just blended into an unremarkable background. Only when encountering someone from a different environment, a traveler from a distant region, someone who had recently bathed, a noble with perfumed clothing, would medieval noses notice a difference, and often that difference was viewed with suspicion. Why did this person smell different? What were they hiding? So yes, in medieval winters filth wasn't failure, it was fashion, it was function. And if you had a thick, greasy outer layer by February, you, my friend, were winning at life. The spring cleaning ritual, when it finally came, must have been momentous. As temperatures rose and survival became less precarious, peasants would finally peel off their layers, assess the damage and attempt some level of washing and repair. Clothes that had been worn continuously for 4 or 5 months would be stiff with grime, discolored beyond recognition, and often falling apart. The washing process was less about restoring them to newness. That was impossible, and more about removing the worst of the accumulated filth, so they could be worn again in the coming year. Some garments were so far gone they could only be repurposed into rags, patches or stuffing for mattresses. Others, with enough washing, beating and effort, could be salvaged for another season. But that was a problem for spring. In the depths of winter, dirt was your friend, grime was your ally, and the person who smelled the worst was probably surviving the best. Sleeping on crunchy plants. If you thought medieval peasants spent their winters tucked into plush feather beds with embroidered quilts, think again. The reality was a bit more rustic. And by rustic I mean, let's sleep on a pile of dead plants and hope for the best. Beds in the medieval peasant world were usually a rough wooden frame. If you could afford one, covered with a big sack stuffed full of straw, hay, or old rushes. That's it. No memory foam, no orthopedic support, no five-star hotel experience. Just a crunchy, lumpy, slightly pokey mess that smelled faintly of barnyard and regret. The wooden bed frame, when present, was a simple construction. 4 posts at the corners, connected by rough planks or rope lattice to support the mattress. The frame kept you elevated slightly off the cold floor, which was its primary benefit. It also kept you away from the worst of the dirt and the small creatures that crawled across the floor at night. But many peasants didn't even have this luxury. The bed frame required wood, which had other uses and considerable value, and carpentry skills. Many families simply skipped it entirely. Every toss and turn in the night brought a delightful soundtrack of crinkling straw and the occasional sharp jab from a rogue stork. The sound of a straw bed being used was distinctive, a constant rustling, crunching, shifting noise that accompanied every movement. In a house where multiple people slept on straw, the nighttime audio landscape included a symphony of crunching and rustling as different people adjusted positions throughout the night. The pokiness was unavoidable. Straw and hay are, by nature, composed of plant stalks with pointed ends. Packing them into a cloth sack didn't eliminate these points, it just contained them temporarily. As you lay on the mattress, your body weight compressed the material, and the pointy ends found their way through the fabric, jabbing into your back, legs and sides. You'd constantly shift position, trying to find an arrangement where fewer points were actively stabbing you. But movement redistributed the straw inside, creating new configurations of pokey discomfort. It was a nightly battle you could never quite win. Fleas as bedmates. Some peasants even skipped the wooden frame altogether and just threw the straw straight onto the dirt floor, creating a luxurious ground-level sleeping experience that modern influencers would probably rebrand as earth-connected slumber. This ground-level approach had a certain logic. Why build a wooden frame when the straw itself provided some elevation and insulation? Why invest resources in construction when those resources could be used for food or firewood? The downside, of course, was that you were essentially sleeping directly on the floor with only a layer of straw between you and the frozen earth. All the cold rising from the ground had minimal barrier. The dampness of the dirt floor soaked into the bottom layer of straw, making it moldy and further reducing its insulation value. The straw mattresses weren't just uncomfortable, they were temporary. Over time, the straw flattened, grew moldy, attracted bugs, and generally turned into a biological hazard zone. Straw and hay decompose. Even when kept relatively dry, they break down slowly, creating dust and releasing spore. When they get damp, which happened constantly in medieval homes with dirt floors and leaky roofs, decomposition accelerates. The straw turned brown, then black. It developed a characteristic moldy smell. It became slimy to the touch. The decomposition process also generated heat. In a strange way, this was almost beneficial. Your slowly rotting mattress actually contributed a tiny amount of warmth, but the health effects were not great. Breathing in mold spores and the dust from decomposing plant material contributed to respiratory problems. Changing the straw was a big event, usually done a few times a year if you were diligent or whenever your bed started actively moving without your permission. The signs that your straw needed replacing were clear. When the mattress had compressed so much that you could feel every lump in the floor beneath you, it was time. When the smell of rot overwhelmed even a medieval nose that had adapted to many unpleasant odors, it was time. When you saw bugs crawling out of the mattress in disturbing numbers, it was definitely time. The process of changing straw was labor-intensive. First, you dragged the old straw out of the house, a heavy, awkward task. Then you cleaned the area where it had been, removing the worst of the accumulated filth. Then you collected fresh straw if you could find it. By late winter, clean, dry straw was scarce, stuffed it into the cloth sack if you had one, or simply piled it up if you did. Fresh straw was wonderful for about a week. It smelled relatively pleasant, like dried grass and fields. It was springy and provided actual cushioning. Sleeping on fresh straw must have felt like a luxury after months on compressed, moldy material. But within days, the compression began. Within weeks, the mold started. Within months, you were back where you started. Replacing moldy straw, rushes were a popular alternative. These long grasses were spread thick on the floor, sometimes mixed with herbs like lavender or rosemary, to mask the overwhelming odor livestock aroma of daily life. Russia's tall, reed-like plants that grew in wet areas were abundant and free for the gathering. They could be cut, dried and brought home in large bundles. Spread thickly on the floor, they provided a softer surface than bare dirt and offered some insulation. The practice of strewing rushes on floors was common among both peasants and nobility, though nobles could afford to change them more frequently and add expensive herbs to the mix. The herb mixture served multiple purposes. Lavender, rosemary, mint and other aromatic plants helped mask unpleasant smells. They also had mild antimicrobial properties and repelled some insects. Walking on the rushes released their scent, providing brief moments of pleasant aroma in an otherwise malodorous environment. Fresh rushes smelled lovely for about a day. After that, they became part of the muddy, trampled landscape inside the house, blending seamlessly with dirt, food scraps and whatever else wandered in. The lifespan of rushes was similar to straw. They compressed under foot traffic, absorbed moisture from the air and floor, accumulated filth, and gradually decomposed, but unlike straw mattresses that could be taken outside and replaced as a unit, floor rushes required constant maintenance. The medieval practice was to add new layers of fresh rushes on top of old ones rather than removing the old layers first. This created a gradually thickening floor covering, with fresh material on top and increasingly ancient, compressed material below. Historical accounts suggest that some establishments, particularly those of wealthy households that could afford abundant rushes, might have layers that accumulated over months or even years. The bottom layers would be unrecognizable as rushes, having compressed and decomposed into a kind of composted mat, and let's not forget the bedfellows. Fleas, lice and other charming critters loved straw bedding almost as much as the peasants did. If you woke up scratching more than you slept, congratulations, you were living the authentic medieval experience. Insects were inescapable companions in medieval beds. Straw and hay provided perfect habitat for numerous species. Fleas, in particular, thrived in this environment. They laid eggs in the straw, and their larvae fed on the organic debris that accumulated dead skin cells, dried blood from biting humans during the night, and bits of food. A well-established straw mattress could house thousands of fleas in various life stages. When you lay down, the vibrations and carbon dioxide from your breathing signaled feeding time, and the fleas would emerge to bite. Flea bites were itchy and annoying, but they were also dangerous. Fleas could transmit diseases, including the infamous bubonic plague. Every flea bite was a potential vector for infection. Lice were equally problematic. Body lice lived in clothing and bedding, emerging to feed on human blood. Their bites caused intense itching. Scratching created open wounds that could become infected. Lice also transmitted diseases, including typhus. Bed bugs, though less common than fleas and lice, also made appearances. They hid in the wooden bed frame cracks during the day, and emerged at night to feed. Medieval people tried various remedies. Hanging certain herbs, wormwood, tansy, rue, near the bed was believed to repel insects. Occasionally burning sulfur in the room was thought to kill bugs. Some people would bake their straw mattresses, literally putting them in an oven, or by the fire to kill insects with heat. But none of these methods were particularly effective. The insects always came back, so people learned to live with constant itching, constant scratching, and the knowledge that they shared their beds with numerous small creatures. A minor miracle. Despite the hardships, these humble beds were lifesavers. Piles of straw provided a crucial insulating layer against the frozen earth, and clumping together atop them created pockets of shared body heat. Medieval central heating at its finest. The insulation value of straw, even compressed straw, was significant. It created an air gap between the sleeper and the floor. Air is a poor conductor of heat, so this gap reduced heat loss to the ground. When multiple people slept on the same straw bed, their combined weight compressed it further, but their combined body heat more than compensated. The straw trapped this heat beneath and around them, creating a warmer microenvironment than any individual could achieve alone. In this sense, the straw bed was essential technology. Without it, sleeping directly on frozen ground would be nearly impossible. The straw was the buffer, the insulation, the foundation that made winter survival feasible. So next time you sink into your soft, supportive mattress with its multiple layers of foam and its breathable cover and its complete lack of insects, just remember, somewhere out there, a medieval peasant is looking down at you from history, grinning through a mouthful of missing teeth and saying, "Must be nuts." That medieval peasant might also be thinking, "But you know, we managed, we survived, we made do with straw and shared warmth, and sheer determination, and that's worth something." Because they did survive, not comfortably, not pleasantly, but they survived, and their survival, against odds we can barely imagine, is a testament to human resilience, adaptability, and the ability to endure hardship that would break modern people. The straw beds of medieval peasants were miserable by our standards,
uncomfortable, unsanitary, infested with vermin, but they were sufficient. They got the job done. They kept people off the frozen ground and provided just enough insulation to make survival possible. And sometimes in history, sufficient is heroic.
Stuffing gaps with anything. When you live in a house made of sticks, mud, and optimism, you quickly learn that winter breezes aren't just a nuisance, they're personal attacks. Medieval peasants didn't just fight the cold from the outside, they fought it from inside their own homes, armed with nothing but whatever they could cram into the cracks. And trust me, there were a lot of cracks. Walls warped, mud crumbled, thatch sagged. The cold seemed to find new places to sneak in every night, like a mischievous poltergeist with a grudge. The structure of wattle and daub construction, while ingenious with available materials, was inherently vulnerable to degradation. The wooden framework would shrink and swell with changes in temperature and humidity. The daub coating would crack as it dried. The different materials, wood, mud, straw, expanded and contracted at different rates, creating gaps at their junctions. Every winter brought new damage. Freezing temperatures caused moisture in the walls to expand, cracking the mud. Thawing created settlement and shifting. The cycle repeated dozens of times each winter, and each cycle widened existing cracks and created new ones. By the time spring arrived, the house would be thoroughly deteriorated. But peasants couldn't rebuild every spring. They had crops to plant and other survival priorities, so they patched, repaired and made do, knowing that the coming winter would damage their repairs and the cycle would continue. Moss, rags and animal hair. Sealing up the house became an art form. Peasants stuffed gaps with moss, straw, scraps of old cloth, bundles of dry grass, and sometimes even animal hair. If it was soft, squishy, or vaguely insulating, it was jammed into a hole somewhere. The gathering of gap-stuffing materials was an ongoing task. Children were often sent to collect moss from trees and rocks. Moss was excellent for stuffing. It was soft, abundant, free, and had decent insulating properties. Its fibrous structure trapped air effectively. Old cloth was precious. When a garment finally wore out beyond any possibility of further repair, it wasn't discarded. It was cut into strips and used for stuffing gaps, wrapping wounds, making patches, or a dozen other purposes. Nothing was wasted. Animal hair, particularly from sheep shearing, was collected and saved. The coarse outer hair wasn't suitable for spinning into yarn, but it was perfect for stuffing. Pressed into cracks, it expanded slightly and created an effective barrier against drafts. Dried grass and straw, while less ideal than moss, were abundant and could be gathered in large quantity. Twisted into tight bundles, they could be wedged into gaps. The stuffing process required ingenuity. Some cracks were easy to access and stuff. Others were in awkward locations, high up near the roofline, behind furniture, in corners where the walls met. Peasants used sticks to push stuffing material deep into cracks, ensuring it filled the gap completely. Annual dung smearing projects. Some particularly determined souls daubed extra layers of mud and dung over the outside of their walls as an annual winter project. Imagine standing there in freezing weather, slapping cold manure onto your own house while muttering, "This is fine, this is luxury." Because in a way it was. The annual redaubing was serious maintenance work. As autumn approached and before the worst weather arrived, peasants would mix fresh batches of mud, clay, straw and dung. This mixture would be prepared to the right consistency, thick enough to stick to the wall, but thin enough to be workable. Then, in a multi-day project, they'd apply this mixture to the outside walls, paying special attention to areas where cracks had appeared, or where the old daub had eroded. It was cold, messy, exhausting work. Your hands would crack and bleed from the rough materials and cold. The smell was unpleasant even by medieval standards, but it was necessary. A well-daubed house stood a much better chance of keeping out the worst cold. The new layer sealed cracks, added thickness to thin spots, and provided a fresh barrier against wind and moisture. Some peasants took particular pride in their daubing work. They'd smooth the surface carefully, create decorative patterns, even add colored clay or other materials to create simple design. It was one of the few opportunities for artistic expression in peasant life, though function always trumped form. Roof leaks were another battlefield. Thatch, while cheap and plentiful, wasn't exactly waterproof, especially after a few seasons of rain and snow. Peasants would plug holes in the roof with spare bits of cloth, bundles of reeds, or in moments of true desperation, chunks of turf stolen from the nearest field. Roof repair was dangerous work. Climbing onto a steep, slippery thatched roof, especially in cold weather when ice might be present, risked serious falls, but leaks couldn't be ignored.
Water dripping onto your sleeping area in freezing weather could be fatal. The repair materials were whatever could be found. A section where thatch had blown away might be patched with a bundle of straw, tied down with rope or strips of leather. A persistent leak might be covered with a piece of old canvas or leather if available, weighted down with stone. Every home eventually started to look like a slightly sad patchwork quilt made by someone who gave up halfway through. The accumulation of repairs over multiple seasons created a house that was more patched than original structure. Different materials, different textures, different colors, all visible evidence of the ongoing battle against deterioration. But each patch, each stuffed crack, each daubed repair represented hours of work and careful attention. The house might not be pretty, but it was defended, a fortress of desperation against the cold. Doors and windows, if you had them, were another challenge. Even well-fitted wooden doors developed gaps as the wood aged and warped. Window openings, usually covered with animal hides or thick cloth, were perpetual weak points. Door gaps were stuffed with cloth or straw along the edges. Some peasants hung additional cloth or leather curtains inside the door to create a dead air space that reduced heat loss. Others would pack straw or hay against the door on the inside, essentially blocking it shut for the winter, using a different exit or simply accepting the inconvenience of removing the packing whenever they needed to go out. Windows were often covered with thick animal hides, usually cattle, sheep or pigs. These hides were soaked in animal fat or oil to make them somewhat translucent, allowing a little light through and more water resistant. They were nailed or tied over the window open. But animal hide shrinks and becomes brittle in cold weather. It also degraded over time. By midwinter, many window coverings had cracks and gaps. These were patched with smaller pieces of hide, cloth or even bladder, which was more elastic and transparent than skin. Some peasants simply sealed windows completely for winter, nailing boards over them or daubing mud over the entire opening. They accepted the resulting darkness as preferable to the cold drafts. Every night was a battle between human ingenuity and the relentless, sneaky cold. One minute you were warm, the next minute a sudden gust would find the one spot you missed, slapping you awake like a frosty hand of doom. The cold seemed almost alive in its persistence, probing, searching, finding weaknesses. You'd seal one crack, and the cold would find another. You'd stuff one gap and tomorrow a new one would appear. It was exhausting and demoralizing, but giving up meant freezing, so you didn't give up. You patched, stuffed and sealed, again and again all winter long. Yet somehow, through cleverness, stubbornness and a refusal to accept slightly frozen as a permanent state of being, medieval peasants patched, stuffed and muddled their way through the worst winters nature could throw at them, one muddy handful at a time. The spring assessment of winter damage must have been sobering. Looking at your home in the harsh light of spring, seeing just how much damage had occurred despite all your efforts, would reveal the true cost of winter survival. But then you'd begin repairs again, preparing for the next winter, knowing that the cycle would continue, because that's what survival required: endless effort, endless adaptation, endless stubborn refusal to surrender to the cold.
Someone always awake. When the cold bites hard enough to keep you awake at night, medieval peasants had a solution. Don't even try to pretend everyone's sleeping at once. Instead, they developed a survival strategy that today would make any military commander proud: sleeping in shifts. It wasn't some grand organized system with whistles and roll calls. It was far simpler and much more desperate. Half the household stayed awake, tending to the fire and patching up stray drafts, while the other half curled up under threadbare blankets and hay, trying to catch a few precious hours of half-frozen sleep. The shift system developed organically out of necessity. Early in winter, families might attempt to all sleep simultaneously, with perhaps one adult rising occasionally to check the fire. But as temperatures dropped and nights grew more dangerous, this proved insufficient. A fire left untended for 6 or 7 hours would die to cold ash. A draft that opened during the night could lower the interior temperature dramatically before anyone woke to address it. Several families probably learned these lessons the hard way, waking to a dead fire and dangerously cold conditions, or worse, not waking at all. So, the practice evolved. Someone was always awake, not necessarily doing intensive work, but present, aware, monitoring the situation, ready to respond to problems before they became catastrophic. Ember patrol duty. The fire needed constant attention. Left alone, it would die down, and restarting it, remember, was about as easy as getting a stubborn donkey to dance. So someone had to be on ember patrol, and since no one wanted to get up once they were finally warmish, families rotated shifts. You dozed for a few hours, got elbowed awake, then stumbled over to the hearth to poke, prod and curse the fire back to life while trying not to step on a goat. The rotation varied by family. In some households, adults took all the shifts, letting children sleep through. In others, older children were included in the rotation as soon as they were responsible enough to manage fire safely. A typical shift might last 2 to 3 hours. When your shift ended, you'd wake the next person, brief them on the fire's condition, added wood an hour ago, should be good for a while, or fire's low, needs attention, and then gratefully collapse into the warm spot you'd just vacated. The warm spot was crucial. Wherever you'd been sitting or lying, your body heat had warmed that space. The next person could immediately benefit from that residual warmth, at least for a few minutes until it dissipated. The duties of the night watch person varied, but typically included fire maintenance. The primary responsibility, this meant checking the fire every 30 minutes or so, ensuring it hadn't died down too much or burned too high, adding fuel when needed, banking it properly if everyone would be sleeping soon. Knowing how much fuel to add and when was a skill that came with experience. Draft patrol, feeling around the walls and floor for new draft. If you felt cold air flowing from somewhere, you'd investigate and stuff something into the gap if possible. Many repairs that seem random by daylight made perfect sense to the person who discovered the draft at 2. Animal management, ensuring livestock were settled and not disturbing sleeping family members. A restless cow could wake everyone. A pig that had wandered too close to the fire was a hazard. The night watch person would gently redirect animals as needed. Security, listening for sounds that didn't belong, wolves, thieves, or simply the wind picking up to dangerous levels. In a world without police or emergency services, you were your own security. The rotation wasn't glamorous. There were no night vision goggles, no late night snacks. Food was too precious to waste on midnight eating, and certainly no 5 more minutes snooze buttons. Just stiff joints, heavy eyelids, and a growing resentment toward whoever snored loudest during your shift. The psychological challenge of night watch was significant. It was lonely, dark, cold. The rest of your family was sleeping or trying to, so you had to be quiet. No singing to stay awake, no loud activity, just sitting in the dimly lit darkness, fighting to stay alert when your body desperately wanted to sleep. The temptation to close your eyes just for a moment was powerful and understandable. You were chronically sleep deprived, exhausted from daily labor, and sitting in a warmish spot next to the fire. Fighting off sleep required constant effort. Some people developed strategy. They'd do mindless, quiet tasks, sorting seeds for spring planting, mending clothes by firelight, twisting rope from scrap fibers. Others would pray, reciting familiar prayers over and over to keep their minds engaged. Some just pinched themselves or bit their cheeks to stay awake. Medieval night watch. Children old enough to hold a stick were pressed into service, learning early that in winter everyone pulled their weight or froze trying. Grandparents sometimes stayed by the fire longer, both because of their experience, and frankly because arthritis made lying down and getting up again a monumental event. Including children in the watch rotation was necessary, but also served as education. A 10-year-old taking their first solo night watch shift was learning responsibility, fire management, and the serious consequences of failure. If they let the fire die because they fell asleep, everyone suffered. The lessons. Grandparents with their decades of experience often took the late night or early morning shifts. They knew fire behavior intimately, how different woods burned, how to judge when the fire needed attention just by looking at it, how to bank it perfectly. Their presence on night watch was both practical and comforting. The elderly also often had trouble sleeping due to various aches and ailments. Rather than tossing and turning and disturbing others, they might as well sit by the fire and make themselves useful. It gave them purpose and respect within the family structure. And when it was your turn to sleep, good luck. With people moving about, animals rustling, wind battering the walls, and the occasional sharp nudge from a sibling who accidentally rolled over too hard, getting quality rest was a miracle. Sleep in the medieval winter was never deep, restorative, or truly restful. It was a series of naps interrupted by cold, noise, discomfort, and the inevitable moment when you had to take your shift at watch. The chronic sleep deprivation affected everyone. People were constantly tired, operating on insufficient rest. This made them more vulnerable to illness, less efficient at work, and quicker to anger. But there was no alternative. You either accepted fragmented sleep, or you died of cold. Yet despite the exhaustion, the system worked. Sleeping in shifts meant that there was always a set of eyes and cold, begrudging hands ready to keep the hearth alive. The embers survived, and by extension so did the family.
The moment when you completed your watch shift and someone else took over was blessed relief. You'd been fighting cold and sleepiness for hours. Now you could finally rest, knowing someone else was responsible for keeping the fire alive. You'd find your spot in the sleeping pile, hopefully a warm one, and sink into sleep with gratitude despite the discomfort, despite the noise, despite everything. Because for the next few hours, survival wasn't your responsibility, it was someone else's turn to stand guard against the cold. So next time you grumble about waking up to adjust the thermostat, or let the cat out, spare a thought for the medieval peasant squinting into a smoking fire at 3 a.m., wondering if toes were really that important after all. The modern convenience of sleeping through the night, undisturbed, with reliable heating that requires no human intervention. This is luxury almost beyond medieval comprehension. We take it for granted. They fought for it every single winter night, and considered themselves fortunate when they won.
Shallow nose breathing. Oh no, it's cold when you have to think about how you breathe just to stay alive. Medieval peasants didn't just battle the freezing air with cloaks, fires, and creative sleeping arrangements. They even adjusted the way they inhaled and exhaled to survive the night. The problem was simple. Deep, open-mouthed breathing pulled icy air straight into your lungs. In a world where pneumonia could kill you faster than you could say Hail Mary, that was a risk nobody wanted to take. The physiology here is straightforward. Cold air entering the lungs causes several problems. First, it forces the body to expend energy, warming that air to body temperature, before it can be used for oxygen exchange. This wastes precious calories that were already in short supply. Second, extremely cold air can damage the delicate tissues of the lungs and airways. Repeated exposure to freezing air causes inflammation, making the respiratory system more vulnerable to infection. Third, breathing cold air dries out the mucous membranes that line the respiratory tract. These membranes are part of the immune system's first defense. They trap pathogens before they can cause infection. When they dry out, they become less effective, and infections become more likely. Medieval people didn't understand these mechanisms, but they understood the outcome. Breathe too much cold air, and you get sick. Get sick in winter, and you might die, creating a breath warmer barrier. So peasants learned the art of what you might call survival breathing. Instead of sucking in huge gulps of air like they'd just run a marathon, they kept their breathing shallow, slow, and most importantly, through the nose. The idea was to gently warm the incoming air a bit before it hit their lungs. It wasn't perfect, but it was better than coughing yourself into the grave by February. Nasal breathing has significant advantages in cold weather. The nasal passages are lined with blood vessels close to the surface. As cold air passes through, it's warmed by contact with these warm surfaces. By the time the air reaches the lungs, it's been preheated, not to body temperature, but enough to reduce the thermal shock. The nasal passages also add moisture to the air. Cold air tends to be dry. Cold air can't hold as much water vapor as warm air. Breathing through the nose adds humidity, protecting the respiratory system from drying out. Additionally, the nose filters particulate matter, dust, smoke particles, and other irritants. In a smoke-filled medieval house, this filtering function was particularly valuable. The technique required discipline. When you're cold and stressed, the natural tendency is to breathe deeply and quickly, gulping air in panic. Fighting this instinct and maintaining slow, shallow, nasal breathing was difficult, especially for children. If you accidentally took a big mouthful of cold air, congratulations, you just bought yourself a ticket to a week of hacking up bits of what felt like your soul. With no doctors in sight and grandma treating you with hot onion tea and firm prayer. Respiratory infections in winter were common and often fatal. What we would now treat with antibiotics and modern medicine, pneumonia, bronchitis, pleurisy, were death sentences in medieval time. Once a serious respiratory infection took hold, there was little that could be done except keep the person warm, pray, and hope their body could fight it off. The treatments available were folk remedies of varying effectiveness. Hot onion tea, garlic, honey, various herbs. Some of these had mild antibacterial or immune-boosting properties, but mostly they offered comfort rather than cure. The prayers were probably as effective as the medicine. Watching someone die of a respiratory infection was traumatic. The struggling for breath, the fever, the delirium, the slow suffocation as fluid filled the lungs. Families who lost members to winter respiratory illnesses learned to be fanatical about breathing technique, teaching children not to pant. Some people even tucked parts of their cloaks, shawls, or rags up over their faces while they slept, creating a makeshift breath warmer barrier. Of course, this also meant you ended up with a damp, slightly soggy fabric patch clinging to your mouth by morning. But hey, it beat freezing from the inside out. The The face covering created a small air pocket in front of the nose and mouth. Exhaled breath, which is warm and moist, would be partially trapped in this pocket. Subsequent inhales would draw from this pocket, meaning the air being breathed was slightly warmer and more humid than the ambient air. The accumulation of moisture on the fabric was unavoidable. Each exhale deposited water vapor. By morning the cloth was damp or even frozen stiff if temperatures were low enough. Waking up with frozen cloth stuck to your face was unpleasant. But again it beat dying of pneumonia. Some people used scarves or strips of wool wrapped loosely around the lower face. Others simply pulled their cloak or blanket up over their nose. The poor had rags. The principle was the same: create a barrier that pre-warms and humidifies the air. Children were taught these tricks early on. Parents would scold little ones for panting like dogs indoors during the cold months. And honestly, between strict breathing lessons, itchy wool layers, and sleeping next to an aggressively gassy goat, medieval childhood winters were character building on a whole different level. Children, being children, didn't naturally understand why breathing technique mattered. They breathed however felt natural, which often meant mouth breathing, especially when excited or playing. Teaching them to breathe through their noses required constant reminders and corrections. Close your mouth, breathe through your nose, slow down your breath. These admonishments would be repeated hundreds of times throughout a winter. Children who didn't learn the lesson might get sick. Sick children might die. So the lesson was taught firmly and consistently. The character building aspect was real. Medieval children grew up understanding that survival required constant vigilance and self-discipline. You couldn't just do what felt natural or easy. You had to think about every action, from how you breathed to how you moved, because carelessness could be fatal. This created adults who were tough, careful, and acutely aware of their environment. They didn't have the luxury of thoughtlessness that modern life permits. At night, tucked into straw bedding under piles of cloaks, and next to a gently steaming cow, breathing became an art. Slow, steady, nose only, and as minimal as humanly possible, like some grim medieval version of a yoga retreat, only with more frostbite and fewer inspirational quotes. The breathing rhythm during sleep was something people had to train themselves into. Natural sleep breathing tends to be deeper and slower than waking breathing. But in extreme cold, even sleep breathing needed to be controlled. Some people would lie on their sides, burying their faces partially into their straw bedding or blankets, creating a natural air pocket that trapped exhaled warmth. Others slept face up with cloth over their face. Each person developed their own technique based on what worked for their body and circumstances. The quality of sleep suffered from this conscious breathing control. Deep, restorative sleep requires relaxation, but maintaining breathing discipline requires a level of consciousness that prevents full relaxation. So medieval peasants probably never achieved the deep, restorative sleep that humans need for optimal health. This chronic sleep deprivation, combined with malnutrition and constant physical stress, created a population that was tough but exhausted. They survived, but they were always operating at less than full capacity. In the grand survival playbook, it wasn't the flashiest strategy, but it was one shallow breath at a time. Peasants endured another night in the long, relentless war against winter. The cumulative effect of all these small strategies, the fire banking, the communal sleeping, the livestock warmth, the layered clothing, the gap stuffing, the shift sleeping, and yes, the controlled breathing added up to survival. No single strategy was sufficient, but together they created a system that worked well enough that families made it through winter and lived to face the next one. Medieval winter survival was death by 1,000 cuts in reverse, life by 1,000 small, unglamorous, uncomfortable strategies that collectively kept you breathing until spring. Calories equal warmth. In the endless battle against medieval winter, peasants discovered an unlikely secret weapon: a full stomach. Turns out, one of the best ways to fight off the cold wasn't another scratchy wool cloak. It was stuffing yourself with something hearty and heavy right before bed. Calories meant warmth. The more your body had to digest, the more it heated itself up doing the work. It's basic medieval thermodynamics. Eat a heavy meal, generate internal heat, and maybe, just maybe, survive until morning without turning into a peasant-shaped popsicle. The science behind this strategy is sound. Digestion is a metabolic process that generates heat as a byproduct. This is called the thermic effect of food. Different macronutrients generate different amounts of heat during digestion. Protein generates the most, followed by carbohydrates, then fats. But for medieval peasants, who rarely had access to significant protein, the key was simply eating enough volume. A stomach full of food, even if it was mostly carbohydrates and fiber, required hours of digestive effort. During those hours, the body generated extra heat that radiated through the torso and helped maintain core body temperature. Additionally, a full stomach provided a kind of thermal mat. Food at room temperature, or fire temperature if heated, carried heat into the body's core, where it was absorbed slowly as digestion proceeded. Turnip stew as fuel. So what did medieval peasants pile onto their plates before a long freezing night? Think thick stews, heavy with root vegetables like turnips, onions, and parsnips. Grains were lifesavers too. Oat porridge, barley gruel, or dense, chewy rye bread. If you were especially lucky, say after a festival day or a generous slaughter, you might even get a hunk of salted pork, or a slice of dried sausage thrown into the pot. The evening meal was the most substantial meal of the day for most peasants. Morning might see a small breakfast of leftover bread and weak ale. Midday might bring bread and cheese if you were fortunate. But evening was when the serious eating happened. The stew pot, hanging over the fire, was a communal resort. Everything edible went into it. Root vegetables dug from storage, dried peas or beans if available, scraps of fat or meat if you had any, wild herbs for flavor, and water or weak broth. It simmered for hours, filling the house with aroma and Root vegetables, turnips, parsnips, carrots, onions, were winter staples because they stored well. Kept in a cool, dark root cellar or pit, they lasted months. They weren't exciting food. In fact, turnips were considered the food of poverty even by medieval standards. But they were filling, they provided calories and they kept you alive. Grains provided the bulk of calories. Oat porridge was a thick, gluey mass that sat heavily in the stomach. Barley gruel was rye bread, dense and coarse, was filling and required serious chewing, which actually helped, because the mechanical act of chewing also generates some heat. This wasn't comfort food in the Instagram sense. No delicate presentation, no artisanal garnish. It was one enormous vaguely brown meal, designed to sit in your gut like a friendly brick, slowly burning through the night and keeping you just a little bit warmer. The appearance of the food was unappealing. Everything was boiled to softness in the stew. Colors faded to various shades of brown and gray. Textures became uniformly mushy, but appearance didn't matter. Function mattered. Taste was similarly unexciting. Most peasants had little access to spices or salt. Salt was expensive and carefully rationed. Flavor came from whatever vegetables were available, maybe some wild garlic or herbs if someone had gathered them in autumn, and the natural flavors of the grains, which is to say, not much flavor at all. But when you're hungry and cold, even bland food tastes good. And the psychological comfort of eating warm food, feeling the warmth spread through your body from the inside, was significant. Digesting through the night, it wasn't just about eating a lot, it was about eating smart. Foods that took longer to digest provided a slow, steady trickle of warmth. Fatty foods were particularly prized, not just for the energy they provided, but because fat burns slower than lean meat. A belly full of stew, bread and a questionable amount of lard. Peak medieval winter luxury. The ideal winter meal was high in both volume and energy density. You wanted your stomach stretched to capacity, triggering satiety signals and creating that thermal mass effect, but also wanted foods that would release energy slowly over many hours. Fats were rare but treasured. Animal fat, lard from pigs, tallow from cattle, drippings from any cooked meat, was saved carefully. A spoonful of fat added to your evening porridge or stew provided concentrated calories. It also slowed digestion. Fat takes longer to break down than carbohydrates, extending the warming effect through the night. Beans and peas, dried and stored from the previous harvest, were excellent winter food. They provided protein rare in the peasant diet, fiber, and complex carbohydrates. They digested slowly and kept you feeling full for hours. The downside, of course, was flatulence, but in a house full of people and animals, this was barely noticeable amid the general atmosphere. Parents made sure even the pickiest children ate heartily. Nobody cared if little Thomas didn't like turnips. You ate the turnips or you shivered through the night thinking about how much you missed the turnips. Harsh, but effective parenting. Medieval children's smaller bodies lost heat more quickly than adults. Ensuring they ate substantial evening meals was literally a matter of life and death. Parents would coax, cajole, and if necessary, order their children to eat more. Finish your bowl wasn't just about manners or avoiding waste, it was about keeping the child alive until morning. Children who refused to eat adequately would wake in the night shivering and miserable, disturbing everyone else. They'd be more vulnerable to illness. So parents were strict about evening eating,
and children learned quickly that compliance was in their own best interest. Of course, heavy nighttime eating came with its own hazard. You might be warmer, but you were also risking a night of vivid, bizarre dreams, fueled by a stomach trying desperately to process an entire field's worth of cabbages. Medieval people believed strongly in the connection between diet and dreams. Certain foods were thought to cause heavy meals before bed definitely caused restless sleep and strange dreams, probably due to the body's digestive system working overtime and affecting sleep quality. You might dream of being chased by giant turnips, of drowning in stew, of bizarre encounters with the vegetables you'd eat. These dreams, while unsettling, were accepted as the price of warmth. Better to have strange dreams while warm than pleasant dreams while freezing. Indigestion was also common. Eating a huge meal and then lying down immediately afterward, rather than staying upright for a while, often caused acid reflux and stomach discomfort. But there wasn't much choice after eating. You needed to get into the sleeping pile to conserve warmth. So people endured the discomfort. Was it worth it? Absolutely. Because in the end, peasants weren't aiming for a Michelin star meal, they were aiming to survive. And if that meant going to bed full, bloated, and breathing gently through your nose next to a steaming cow, well, that was just another night in the ongoing quest to see another frosty sunrise. The morning assessment, did you survive the night, began with internal inventory. How did you feel? Were your extremities numb? Were you shivering uncontrollably? Or did you feel reasonably okay? If you felt okay last night's strategy worked, you'd survived another night, and you'd do it all again tonight. The cumulative exhaustion of winter, the constant cold, the disrupted sleep, the heavy eating, the physical discomfort, took a toll. By late winter, everyone was worn down, but spring was coming. It always came eventually. You just had to survive until then. And survive they did, one heavy meal at a time, one warm belly at a time, one night at a time.
Medieval heating pads. Long before electric blankets and fancy heated mattress pads, medieval peasants had to get creative if they wanted a little extra warmth at bedtime. And that's how the humble haybox and the ever-glamorous heated stone became winter's unsung heroes. Let's start with the haybox. It sounds rustic, and it absolutely was, but the idea was pure genius. Peasants would take a sturdy wooden box, line it thickly with hay, and use it to store food that had been cooked earlier, keeping it warm for hours. Leftover stew, hot porridge, toss it into the haybox, cover it up, and it stayed hot enough for a late-night snack without needing to risk reigniting the fire. The haybox worked on the principle of insulation. Hay, being composed of hollow plant stems, traps air effectively. Air is an excellent insulator. A pot of hot food surrounded by thick hay lost heat very slowly. The hay created a barrier that prevented heat from escaping into the cold environment. Medieval slow cookers basically. But peasants didn't just stop at food. They realized that if hay could trap the heat from a stew pot, it could also trap the heat from something even better, rocks. The brilliant leap was applying this principle not just to food storage but to personal warmth. If a box of hay could keep a pot warm, why not use it to keep people warm? FX. Wrapping hot rocks. Enter the era of the heated stone. Before heading to bed, someone, probably whichever unlucky child lost the family argument, would grab a flat stone and chuck it into the heart of the hearth fire. After roasting it until it was nearly too hot to touch, a fine line between helpful and third-degree burn, they'd fish it out using a stick or some old tongs. The stone selection was important. Not all stones work equally well. Flat, smooth river stones were ideal. They had good thermal mass, meaning they absorbed and held a lot of heat, and were comfortable to have near your body. Rough, porous stones were less effective, and sometimes dangerous. They could crack or explode when heated rapidly, due to trapped moisture. Finding good heating stones was a task done during warmer months. Children would be sent to rivers or streams to collect smooth, flat stones of appropriate size, large enough to hold significant heat, but not so large as to be unmanageable. These stones would be brought home and kept near the hearth, ready for winter use. The heating process took time. You couldn't just toss a stone into the fire for a few minutes and expect it to stay warm all night. The stone needed to be heated thoroughly, usually an hour or more in the hottest part of the fire. This meant planning ahead, putting the stone in the fire well before bedtime. The stone, still radiating blissful warmth, would be carefully wrapped in rags, tucked into an old piece of cloth, or jammed into a clay pot, then slipped under the hay in the mattress or down at the foot of the bed. A medieval heating pad, ready to do battle against the frozen earth. The wrapping was critical. An insufficiently wrapped stone could cause burns. Medieval people didn't have modern understanding of burn treatment.
but they understood that touching extremely hot stones was bad, so they wrapped carefully, using multiple layers of cloth. The placement strategy varied. Some people put the wrapped stone at their feet, where cold was most acutely felt. Others placed it at the small of their back, warming the core. Some families had multiple heated stones distributed strategically throughout the sleeping part, avoiding house fires. Of course, there were risks. If you didn't wrap the stone properly, congratulations, you now had a small localized house fire. And if you dropped it on your foot, well, let's just say winter injuries weren't always caused by slipping on ice. Fire risk was real. If a poorly wrapped stone came into direct contact with straw bedding, it could ignite. In a house made of combustible materials with no fire suppression capability beyond beating the flames with cloth or throwing dirt on them, this was a serious hazard. Stories circulated of families who had lost homes to fires, started by heating stones. These cautionary tales encouraged careful wrapping and constant vigilance. The person responsible for placing the stone would often check it repeatedly in the first hour, feeling the wrapping to ensure it wasn't getting dangerously hot, making sure it was positioned securely where it couldn't roll into contact with unwrapped straw. Dropping a heated stone on your foot would cause immediate severe burns. The stone, even wrapped, retained enough heat to cause tissue damage through cloth shoes or foot wrappings. A dropped stone might also crack or shatter, creating sharp hot fragments. So the handling of heated stones was done carefully, with respect for the danger involved. Children were taught proper technique under supervision before being trusted to handle stones independently. But when everything went right, that stone provided precious, comforting warmth that could last for hours. It wasn't luxurious, but when you lived in a half-frozen hut, luxury was defined as not waking up with icicles dangling from your nose. The duration of warmth varied. A large, properly heated stone wrapped in sufficient insulation could remain comfortably warm for 4 to 6 hours. By morning it would be cool, but those critical hours of warmth during the coldest part of the night made an enormous difference. Some families became sophisticated in their stone heating strategy. They'd heat multiple stones, wrapping and placing them at bedtime. Then during the night, during someone's watch shift, they might swap out cooling stones for freshly heated ones, maintaining warmth throughout the night. This required keeping the fire hot enough to heat stones, using more fuel and the effort of the swap, disturbing sleepers, handling hot stones in darkness. But for families that could manage it, the continuous warmth was worth the trouble. In the grand arsenal of medieval winter survival, a hot rock tucked into some hay might not sound glamorous, but for peasants clinging to whatever heat they could find, it was a tiny miracle. The psychological comfort was as important as the physical warmth. Knowing that you had a warm stone waiting, that you'd taken active steps to improve your comfort, provided mental relief in addition to thermal relief. It was one small area where you had control, where you could do something to make the night more bearable. And in a medieval winter where so much was beyond your control, the weather, the darkness, the overwhelming cold, any sense of agency mattered. The heated stone represented human ingenuity and determination. It was a small victory against the tyranny of winter, and it was celebrated as such.
Strategic positioning. By the hearth, rising out of the gloom like a beacon of hope, the hearth wasn't just the practical center of the medieval home. It was prime real estate when it came to sleeping arrangements. The closer you were to the fire, the better your odds of waking up unfrozen. That meant sleeping arrangements were less about personal preference and more about strategic positioning. It was thermal triage determining who needed the warmth most and arranging bodies accordingly, protecting the weak and elderly, infants. The elderly and anyone sick or frail got first dibs on prime real estate. Parents, older kids, and sturdier adults fanned out from there, like human insulation layers. Being assigned a spot close to the fire wasn't just kindness, it was basic survival math. Babies were fragile heat generators, and elders were precious repositories of family knowledge, and let's be honest, the best gossip. Protecting them with prime warmth was non-negotiable. Infants were particularly vulnerable. Their small bodies had high surface area to volume ratios, meaning they lost heat quickly. They couldn't shiver effectively. Shivering is a heat-generating response that requires muscle mass infants don't yet have, and they couldn't communicate their discomfort clearly or take actions to warm themselves. So infants were placed in the warmest available spots, usually held by their mothers throughout the night, positioned as close to the fire as safely possible. The mother's body heat combined with proximity to the fire gave the infant the best chance of surviving the night. Elderly family members, while not as physically vulnerable as infants, still needed protection. Aging reduces the body's ability to generate and conserve heat. Circulation becomes less efficient. the shivering response weakens. Older people feel cold more acutely and suffer its effects more quickly. But beyond physical vulnerability, the elderly held value as knowledge keepers. They remembered harsh winters from decades past and the strategies that had worked. They knew family history, farming techniques, local geography, and practical wisdom accumulated over lifetimes. Losing an elder meant losing irreplaceable information. So elders were protected, given good sleeping positions, and treated with the respect their knowledge commanded. The sick, regardless of age, needed warmth. Illness makes temperature regulation difficult. Fevers alternate with chill. The immune system fighting infection consumes calories and generates less heat for warmth. A person trying to recover from illness while also fighting extreme cold had minimal chance of survival. So anyone showing signs of illness was moved closer to the fire, given extra covering if available, and monitored carefully throughout the night. One side roasted, one side frozen. But it wasn't all cozy toasting by the flame. Get too close, and you risked waking up with your hair singed or your cloak smoldering suspiciously. Too far and you were basically camping in an icebox. It was a delicate dance. Stay near enough to bask in the fire's glow, but not so near that you had to explain to your neighbor why you now looked like a half-cooked roast. The optimal distance from the fire was surprisingly specific. Too close, within about 3 feet, and the radiant heat became uncomfortably intense on the side facing the fire. Your face, hands and front side would roast, while your backside remained cold. The temperature differential was extreme and uncomfortable. Plus, sparks from the fire were a constant hazard. Fires pop and spark, sending small embers flying. Most fell harmlessly back into the hearth, but some landed on clothing, bedding or skin. A spark landing on dry straw bedding could start a fire. A spark landing on clothing could burn through, potentially injuring the wearer. So sleeping directly next to the fire required constant vigilance. Even while sleeping, people learned to wake instantly if they felt a spark hit them, brushing it away before it could cause damage, but moved too far away beyond about 6 or 7 feet, and the fire's heat barely reached you. Heat radiates in all directions, but it dissipates quickly with distance. The inverse square law applies. Double your distance from the fire and you receive only 1/4 the radiant heat. So there was a narrow Goldilocks zone, close enough to benefit from heat, far enough to avoid catching fire. The best sleeping spots were in this zone, and they were hotly contested, pun intended. The fire also didn't spread warmth evenly. It mostly roasted the people directly in front of it while everyone else fought over the narrow cone of heat, like cold lizards jostling for a sunbeam. The geometry of heat radiation meant that if you were positioned directly facing the fire, you received maximum benefit. But houses were small, and only so many people could fit in direct line of sight to the hearth. Those behind the first row received much less heat. This created a layered arrangement. The most vulnerable were in the front row closest to the fire. The next most vulnerable were in the second row, partially blocked but still receiving some heat. The hardiest adults and older children formed outer layers, receiving minimal direct heat but benefiting from the warmth reflected off walls and from other bodies. If you were lucky enough to fall asleep facing the fire, you might have one blissfully warm side and one side frozen so solid you could probably knock on it like a door. People learned to sleep on their sides facing the fire, slowly rotating during the night like human rotisserie chicken. The rotation was semi-conscious. You'd fall asleep facing the fire, your front warm and comfortable. Gradually your back would get colder and colder until the discomfort woke you. You'd roll over, presenting your cold back to the fire while your now warm front faced away. This cycle repeated throughout the night. Some people developed the skill of rotating without fully waking, a kind of automatic response to cold. Others would wake more fully with each rotation, disrupting their sleep but ensuring both sides of their body got some warmth. Life clinging to warmth. Pets and livestock, of course, muscled in too. A dog might wedge itself between you and the fire, tail wagging dangerously close to open flame. Chickens sometimes perched perilously on hearthstones, clucking softly into the night like tiny, feathery guardians of warmth. Dogs were particularly valued sleeping companions. They generated significant body heat, were loyal, staying put throughout the night rather than wandering like some livestock, and their fur provided additional insulation when snuggled against. Many families had a dog that slept with them specifically for its warming property. The dog also served as an early warning system, barking if it heard unusual sounds outside, potentially alerting the family to threats like wolves or thieves. So dogs that secured prime spots near the fire were serving multiple functions. Cats, being smaller, contributed less warmth but were still welcome for their pest control services and their companionship.
A cat curled on your lap or chest provided a warm purring comfort that was psychologically soothing even if its thermal contribution was mod. Chickens roosting near the hearth sometimes got too close. There are probably forgotten stories of chickens getting their tail feathers singed, causing squawking commotions that woke the entire household. Every crackle of the logs, every shift of glowing embers, was a tiny promise. You're still alive, you're still warm for now. The sound of the fire was reassuring. As long as you could hear it crackling, you knew it was still alive. Silence from the hearth was ominous. It might mean the fire was dying, and immediate action was needed. The glow of the embers provided the only light in the dark house. Even with eyes closed, you could sense its presence. The absence of that glow would be immediately noticeable, triggering waking and action, and so peasants drifted into uneasy sleep, lulled by the fire's pops and hisses, each breath forming small clouds in the frigid air beyond the fire's fragile circle. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't comfortable, but it was life, clinging to warmth by a thread of glowing coals. And in the morning, if you woke up, if the fire still burned, if your toes and fingers still had feeling, that was victory. Another night survived, another day earned, another chance to face whatever winter threw at you next. The morning light, when it came, revealed a house covered in frost on the interior walls, breath clouds hanging in the air, people slowly stirring from uncomfortable sleep, but they were alive. The fire had been maintained, the cold had been held at bay one more time, and that in medieval winter survival was all that mattered.
Hey, are you still there? Or did you fall asleep somewhere between the medieval breathing techniques and the strategic positioning around a smoking fire? If you're still awake and didn't have nightmares about frostbitten toes and aggressive goats, smash that like button and subscribe to the channel for more historical survival stories that'll make you appreciate your thermostat. And drop a comment below if you had to survive just one medieval winter night using these strategies. What scares you the most? Sleeping in a pile with your entire extended family and several farm animals eating nothing but turnip stew for months, or the fact that one carelessly wrapped heated stone could burn your house down? Let me know your thoughts, because tonight you learn that medieval winter survival wasn't about comfort or convenience. It was about doing whatever it took, no matter how uncomfortable, unsanitary, or exhausting, to see another sunrise. Those medieval peasants, huddled in their drafty huts with their livestock roommates and their strategic filth layers, weren't just surviving, they were waging war against winter itself. And they did it without central heating, without modern medicine, without any of the conveniences we take completely for granted. Every strategy we discussed, the fire banking, the communal sleeping, the controlled breathing, the heated stones, the heavy eating, was born from desperate necessity. These weren't lifestyle choices, they were life or death decisions refined over generations of trial and error, with each error potentially meaning someone didn't wake up in the morning. Think about it, they adjusted how they breathed, they strategically chose not to wash, they slept in shifts throughout the night, sacrificing rest to maintain a fire. They shared their sleeping space with animals, whose body heat might mean the difference between life and death. Modern humans, accustomed to adjustable thermostats and fleece blankets, can barely comprehend this level of hardship. We complain when the heat doesn't kick on fast enough. They celebrated if they could feel their toes by morning. So tonight, when you slip into your comfortable bed in your climate-controlled room, maybe take a moment to appreciate what you have. That thermostat you never think about, it's a miracle. That mattress that doesn't contain livestock or insects, luxury beyond medieval imagination. The fact that you can breathe normally without risking pneumonia, an absolute gift. Medieval peasants would look at our modern winter survival setup, our heating systems, our insulated homes, our warm clothing, our abundant food, and think they'd died and gone to heaven. But here's the thing that makes their story so powerful. Despite all that hardship, despite the cold and the darkness and the constant threat of death, they survived. They didn't just survive, they lived. They told stories around the fire, they sang songs, they raised family, they laughed and loved and found moments of joy in the midst of unimaginable difficulty. They were remarkably resilient, these medieval peasants, not because they were superhuman or fundamentally different from us, but because they had no choice. Survival required resilience, so they developed it. Winter demanded ingenuity, so they innovated. The cold tested their determination, and they refused to surrender. Every technique we discussed tonight, from banking fires to sleeping in shifts, from strategic filth to survival breathing, represents human determination at its finest. These weren't ideas handed down from scholars or nobles. They were practical solutions developed by ordinary people facing extraordinary challenges. And they worked. Not perfectly, not comfortably, but well enough. Well enough that families survived winters year after year. Well enough that children grew into adults who taught the same strategies to their own children. Well enough that we're here today, descendants of people who were tough enough to endure what would break most modern humans. So the next time you adjust your thermostat, or complain about your mattress being slightly uncomfortable, remember the medieval peasant who slept on crunchy straw, breathed carefully through their nose, took shifts, maintaining a fire throughout the night, and shared their bed with a goat named Gerald, who had questionable personal hygiene. Remember that your ancestors, all of our ancestors, survived winters like this. They didn't have a choice about whether it was hard, they only had a choice about whether to give up or keep fighting, and they chose to fight, every single night, one cold breath at a time. Their resilience lives in us. Their determination is part of our heritage. The fact that we don't have to exercise that toughness anymore doesn't diminish it, it honors it. They fought so that their descendants wouldn't have to. Now before you drift off to sleep in your warm, comfortable, livestock-free bed, take a moment to appreciate the journey that got us here. From drafty mud huts to insulated homes, from straw mattresses to memory foam, from fire banking to programmable thermostats. Every modern comfort we enjoy was built on the backs of people who survived without them. Every convenience we take for granted represents progress earned through countless generations of hardship. So tonight, as you fall asleep without worrying about whether the fire will last until morning, without needing to take a shift on Ember Patrol, without having to share your pillow with a chicken, remember the medieval peasants who faced winter with nothing but their wits, their stubbornness, and their refusal to let the cold win. Remember their strategies, the fire banking, the communal warmth, the layered clothing, the survival breathing, the heated stones, the heavy meals, the strategic sleeping positions. Remember that human beings are capable of adapting to and surviving conditions that seem impossible. That determination and ingenuity can overcome obstacles that seem insurmountable. That survival isn't about having perfect solutions, it's about having sufficient solutions and the will to implement them. And maybe, just maybe, the next time you face a challenge that seems overwhelming, you'll remember the medieval peasant who survived brutal winter nights with nothing but straw, animal heat, and pure determination. If they could do that, what can you accomplish with all the advantages we have today? Their story isn't just about survival in the past, it's about what humans are capable of when we refuse to give up. It's about resilience, community, ingenuity, and the quiet heroism of ordinary people facing extraordinary circumstances. These weren't legendary warriors or famous heroes, they were farmers, laborers, families, people whose names we'll never know, who left no monuments or memorial. But they left something more important. They left us. Their determination to survive meant future generations got to exist. Their refusal to surrender to the cold echoes through time in every one of us. So as you close your eyes tonight in comfort and warmth, send a thought back through the centuries to those medieval peasants huddled in their smoky huts, maintaining their fires, sharing their warmth, and proving that humans can survive anything if they have the courage to keep trying. Sweet dreams, modern survivors, and remember you're warm tonight because they refused to freeze centuries ago. Sleep well and appreciate every breath you take without thinking about it, every warm moment you experience without effort, and every morning you wake up without having to check if your toes survived the night. Because somewhere in the long chain of history a medieval peasant made it through one more winter night so that eventually you could be here warm and safe, listening to their story, and that, friends, is something worth staying awake for. The end.